Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining day 2. We're just waiting on folks to keep logging in. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. If you just joined us, we're waiting on folks to keep joining. We see the numbers ticking up, so we'll be starting in another minute or so. So good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining for day 2. I think we're going to go ahead and get started now. Want to welcome you and thanks for joining our first ever RAD awardee virtual training hosted by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Over the next few days, we will hear from several experts in the RAD field, both internally at HUD and external experts as well. My name is Christina Payam-Smith, and I'm your host today, along with my other colleague, Erica Ruiz. All participants are muted upon entry. For any technical assistance, please send us a message in the chat box or email called the contact listed on the screen. As you know, this training will take place over 5 sessions spread out over the next 2 weeks. Each day will cover various RAD topics and include panel sessions from PHAs that have been through the process and others. Throughout each session, we will also have a virtual advice booth that you can join at any point during the day and talk to experts about specific questions that you may have. For the best viewing experience, we recommend that you switch your view in the upper right-hand corner to speaker view. This way, the screen is focused on whichever presenter is speaking at one time. We have reserved time in each of these presentations for questions, and I now want to share the ways that you can ask those questions. You can submit questions in the Q&A feature, and our presenters will respond to your questions as they can throughout the presentation. Click the Q&A icon along the bottom of your screen and then submit your question. You can also simply type your question into the chat box and send it to our co-host for the day, Erica. She'll be monitoring the chat box and will read all questions aloud in the order received. If you'd like to be unmuted to ask your question aloud to the group, please send a message in the chat box asking Erica to unmute your line, and we'll do so in the order of questions received. All materials for today's session have been posted on the Rad Resource Desk and can be accessed there. You'll also find some Zoom troubleshooting information and the links to access the advice booth. Finally, at the end of today's session, we'll be hosting coffee breaks for those PHAs that signed up in advance with specific questions that they would like to discuss. For those PHAs, you'll need the coffee break Zoom meeting link, which can be found on the resource desk and will be sent around each day. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Rad Resource Desk. Immediately following the webinar, you'll receive an invitation to complete a survey. In today's webinar, we ask that you complete this with any feedback that you might have for us. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Will Levy to kick us off.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those, our friends on the West Coast. My name is Will Levy. I am the Director of the Program Administration Office in the Office of Recapitalization. Our group works primarily on the policy and program development of RAD, while others, most of our staff in Recap work on transactions and closing. Our smaller group focuses on the policy development side. It's nice to join this conference and to see you all. This is day 2 of 5 of our first ever virtual RAD convening. We were very pleasantly surprised to see that yesterday's session ran very smoothly, that we had over 300 active participants, and that folks seemed pretty satisfied with the overall experience. We debriefed afterwards, and we know we had a couple bugs to work out, and hopefully those are fixed today, but please keep your feedback coming. Yesterday, we went over the Rad Resource Desk, which is a critical tool for you to interact with HUD, gain technical assistance, to get your questions answered, to access resources, to submit transaction materials. We talked about project-based vouchers and project-based rental assistance and some of the key considerations that PHAs think about when choosing between the two options. We discussed how you engage with us and how you access technical assistance. And then many of you met with individual HUD staff during our coffee break, which are these one-on-one breakout sessions to talk about whatever issue your PHA was discussing. I think all of our sessions from yesterday are recorded and will be available on our site. Today, after I finish this piece, we're going to start by diving into the capital needs assessment, which is a key requirement of any public housing property converting through RAD, and one of the first things PHAs should be procuring once they've received a CHAP. The Capital Needs Assessment, or CNA, tells you the condition of your property and the minimum amount of work the property will need to undergo as part of the conversion. It'll also inform how to size replacement reserve deposits initially and over the course of the contract term. So it's a really important document. We'll then spend some time talking about how the capital needs assessment shapes your conversion strategy and the type of transaction you might pursue. About 35% of RAD conversions involve low-income tax credits, but many conversions involve relatively low amounts of upfront work and are funded from funds the PHA has on hand. So in this session, you'll hear about how you might approach the structuring of each of your conversions. The final formal session of the day will cover the fair housing reviews that occur before the PHA submits their financing plan. These reviews serve as an important check to make sure your conversion plans comply with fair housing and civil rights requirements. Throughout the day, you'll be able to jump out of the main Zoom room, step into the advice booth to ask a question. And like yesterday, at the end of all of these sessions, we'll shift over to coffee breaks where you can have a one-on-one conversation with a HUD expert. We ask that you sign up for these in advance so we can make sure we have someone available. So with that, we hope you enjoy the day's sessions and continue to welcome any feedback you may have on how we're conducting these. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Robert?
Yep, thank you, Christina. Thanks, Will. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the PCA presentation. So let me open up my screen here. All right. So as well mentioned, one of the first things that PHA, when they enter the RAD program, should be doing is procuring a PCA, a physical condition assessment. But we've also talked about different terms that we use. And so I wanted to just kind of start with kind of setting the groundwork for everybody. So a PCA, or a physical condition assessment, is also known as a capital needs assessment, or CNA. Some of the folks who have been in the program longer might remember the old RPCA, the RAD physical condition assessment. All of these are the same thing. Basically, a PCA, a CNA, any of those items are basically looking at your property to see what the current condition is, what things need to be done to potentially, bring it up to a little bit better standard potentially, or more importantly, things that are going to be needed over the life of the HAP contract, the 20-year life of the HAP contract, to keep the property in a good position. So that's generally what a PCA is. You're going to hear me refer to the E-tool and the eCNA. Both of those things are generally interchangeable, but I've got some exciting kind of news and some stuff to share with you later in my presentation, because right now the E-tool really is referencing a Excel spreadsheet tool that is then loaded into a web platform, the eCNA validation engine, and then analyzed through that portal, and that is getting ready to change. So we'll be talking about that in a little bit later. Also, I'll be referring to the needs assessor, the assessor, the contractor, the engineer. Basically, those terms are all used to refer to the individuals that you have hired to go and look at your property. Those various individuals have qualifications that they have to meet. Most of them are engineering firms, but that's what I'm referring to when I talk about an assessor. Then we kind of get into the financial terminology, the ADRR, or the annual deposit to your reserve for replacement account, or the initial deposit to the reserve for replacement account, the IDRR. Both the ADRR and the IDRR are used to establish what that baseline balance is in your reserve accounts, and then accounts for draws against those numbers as you do things in years 2, 3, 4, et cetera. And we're going to spend some time talking about how those are sized and different strategies that you use to size those. And then lastly, the scope of work. The scope of work is the work that's going to be done after the RAD conversion. So in that initial year of conversion, it's the work that's identified as quote unquote rehabilitation or rehab, often referred to as the immediate needs or the rehab needs, distinct from the critical repairs. And we're going to talk about all those sorts of things as we get deeper into our presentation today. So as I walk through this, I want you to make sure that you're kind of getting the most out of this presentation. So we're going to focus on the things that we're going to cover today, just to make sure that I'm setting the stage for everybody. We're not going to talk about how you as a PHA are going to procure a needs assessor. We're not going to talk about how the needs assessor submits the CNA, or how you, the PHA, submit the CNA to HUD. We're not going to talk about those sorts of things. But we are going to talk about how you, the PHA, interact with the needs assessor. And how to read the PCA to get the most out of that report, and also how you're going to shape your transaction using that. And just to get a sense of kind of where things are as I'm transitioning through here, I've got a poll that I'd like to have Christina put up and have each of you kind of respond to as we're going through this, so I can get a sense of what you all think about your properties as we're looking at them. So Christina, you want to pop up that poll? There you go, great. So as you're listening to me, let's just a few people answer that poll, and we'll get to the results of that in a minute. To set this in context, currently public housing authorities are trying to maintain their properties the best they can. HUD, and particularly Recap and the RAD program, recognize how there's limited funding that's available, and therefore you have to limit the priorities that you're going to be taking care of. There are oftentimes critical items that, instead of replacing them, you're simply fixing them. They're kind of making do with the best you can. You haven't got a high enough capital fund allocation, and so you're spending operating funds to patch your roof, rather to replace it, those sorts of things. From a capital expenditure standpoint, those capital funds are very precious, and you're only going to spend those when they're absolutely necessary. For most medium to large PHAs, you've got a 10, 15 properties that you're trying to take care of, and HUD is only giving you a lump sum to deal with all of those, and it's never enough to deal with all of them. It may not even be enough to deal with one of them. So you're having to go through and prioritize which roof is going to be replaced. This property needs new windows. Can I do that this year, or do I need to wait until next year? So the timing of that and the adequacy of the funding is really critical for you all right now as you're managing your housing authority properties. And also to that end, you're making things stretch. Refrigerators are only supposed to last 10 to 15 years, and oftentimes you're getting those to last up to 20 years. So while the refrigerator may still be working, it may not be working as efficiently as you would like, or as HUD would like. And so some of the things that you're doing now to overall kind of maintain your property, that's something that the RAD program is designed to change. So Christina, what sort of results have we gotten from our initial polling about the properties? Do you feel like so 79% of you don't feel like you have adequate funding to deal with the capital repairs and replacement? That's perfect, because again, that's what the RAD program is designed to do: figure out how to deal with those capital improvements. So I'm glad to see that response. So we're going to get into that today. So why is a PCA so important? I've already alluded to the fact that the PCA is going to kind of give you a roadmap potentially of things that need immediate needs and that sort of thing. But what are you really going to do with it? So when you hire a needs assessor to go out to your property, they're going to look and see what sort of work has been done, how old are the components of the property, and so what does it look like moving forward? Most items have a useful life that when reached, typically things start to fail. And so you want to start thinking about replacing those on a regular cycle. And that's what the RAD program is all about, is making sure that the capital needs that you have are being met, and met in a timely manner. So the PCA is going to look at things that might already be broken today and need to be fixed immediately. This typically is going to be a health and safety issue. One of the things that you often see are smoke detectors that are not working, electrical plates that are not covered at a family property need to be replaced, or you might see trip hazards, cracks in the pavement, accessibility issues, those sorts of things. And those are items that after the contractors looked at your property, you're going to want to get those fixed even before the RAD transaction closes. Kind of the next level of work that you're going to look at is any necessary rehab. So items that are probably beyond their useful life, while they may not be broken, it's time to replace those. I mentioned in my opening remarks about refrigerators. You've got refrigerators or property that are 20 years old. Those really ought to be replaced, and we ought to be bringing those forward. You want to be getting an Energy Star refrigerator put in place so that it's going to be more energy efficient, and your tenants are going to be happier with their property. And then lastly, setting the ongoing 20-year schedule. So what are you going to need? When are the windows going to need to be replaced? When is your HVAC system going to go out? What about the hot water heaters? You replaced those 4 or 5 years ago, but in the next 20 years, those are going to need to be replaced. So when will they be replaced, and what are you going to replace them with? And that leads to the sizing of your reserve account. Currently in public housing, as I mentioned, operating fund, capital funds, those are coming into you, but you're not really establishing any reserve accounts. Once you finish your RAD conversion, you will be establishing reserve accounts that you'll then be drawing down to use for those capital improvements. So I've got another slide as I'm transitioning in through this another poll that I want to take, just to get a sense of who in the audience has looked at a PCA before. So if you could just do a quick answer to that, and we'll just get a sense of the group on who's actually looked at a PCA in the past. Some of the common deviations that we see in the RAD program, which are absolutely fine, are items that you might want to do after your needs assessor has come out and performed the CNA at your property. So for example, maybe your windows do have a couple of more years left on their useful life, but you know what? You're already doing a lot of other work, and it just makes more sense to go ahead and borrow a little bit more money and go ahead and move those things up and do that in rehab. And that is absolutely fine. And what that's going to do is it's going to decrease the needs that you have to do to reserve for those. So if I've got, for example, $500,000 worth of windows that need to be replaced in year 4 or 5 from my needs assessor's PCA report, and I decide to move those up and do those in my rehab, then those are going to come out of the needs in my reserve accounts. Thus, my annual deposit may go down, or my initial deposit may go down. So figuring out the right amount of money that you either set aside initially or annually to cover these needs is something that's very important when you're looking at the PCA. So Christina, what sort of response have we gotten to our poll about people that have looked at PCAs before? Okay, so 63% have looked at a PCA before. So that's great. So for those of you who've looked at it before, we're going to take a little closer look at them. And then for those of you who haven't looked at it before, this will be new for you, and hopefully you'll learn something. The RAD PCA is a little bit different. There are a few pieces, a few components that the recap office has put in place for PCA that kind of make it, we hope, more useful for a PHA when they get a needs assessment done. But basically, it's going to be made up of kind of two things. There's going to be a narrative report, and then there's going to be data entry. I'm calling it on this slide the specialized CNAE tool, the Excel spreadsheet currently used, and then the web platform that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. But both of these really do need to work in conjunction with each other. The narrative report basically gives kind of a sense from the needs assessor of, what do things look like? It's a little bit more quantitative rather than qualitative. You've got a lot more narrative there where you can kind of read what's the situation, what does the property look like, what's the maintenance schedule look like on the HVAC system, has it been properly maintained, those sorts of things, descriptive things, as opposed to it was installed in January of 2020, or sorry, January of 2000, and needs to be replaced in January of 2020. So that's kind of the difference between kind of the narrative report and the spreadsheet. And in addition to that general description of the property through the narrative, Recap also wants to see an energy audit. An energy audit is very important because it allows the needs assessor to present to the owner opportunities to be more energy efficient through improvements. So while you may think you're doing the most energy efficient or the best for your property, without doing an energy audit, you may not know that. So for example, right sizing the hot water heaters. You might have a property that is all townhouses with individual hot water heaters. And at the time the property was built, 30 years ago, you didn't want anybody to be limited with hot water. And so you put 80-gallon hot water tanks in there. Well, an 80-gallon hot water tank this day and time is not the most efficient solution for most townhouses. So you're going to have a recommendation from the contractor in the energy audit to right size that and bring it down to a 30 or 40-gallon hot water heater based on the demand that's going to be necessary to deal with the tenants. So that's a very important piece of this that Recap really wants to see. So what does a narrative look like? So instead of showing you a report, kind of walking through a draft report, what I did was I kind of pulled out a few of the things that I like to see when I'm looking at a CNA and things that are generally covered. And so one of the contractors that we see a lot does a nice little kind of table giving a description of the property generally. So when the property was built, if there's been any rehabs done, what the occupancy looks like, what is the construction made up of, how big is the property, that sort of thing. So generally just kind of a quick snapshot of what the property looks like. That's then typically followed by some sort of description of the property. In this case, the PCA contractor has created a category called site improvements, which really is a description of the entire site. So in this particular case, we see that we've got 42 three-story walk-up style apartments. So we've got the kind of small scale apartment complex. We also have a leasing office that has the administrative pieces in it with a lounge and a kitchen. It gives us a description of what the property is made out of, constructed of poured concrete. So we're getting an overall sense of kind of what this property is made up of. The gabled roofs. So a nice description of kind of what I'm going to be seeing. And as the owner and as the HUD reviewer, it also gives me a sense of the things that I'm likely to see that are going to show up on my 20-year schedule. So for example, we see that the roofs are pitched gable style design. So a pitched roof means that I'm likely going to be seeing shingles. So those are going to likely need to be replaced over time. This may have been a flat roof. In that case, you're going to have a different kind of solution for the roofing. So it gives you a sense of kind of visualizing what this property looked like and what I can expect to see the needs of the property on this particular case. After that, you want to see a description of kind of what the current conditions are and what's the useful life of the property. So in this case, you see that they've basically said that it's in good to fair condition with a variety of things that need to be done. And you can see that this property was built in the late 60s, early 70s. So there's likely been some rehab done, but it's going to be on a regular schedule. So this is not a more newly constructed property that we're looking at in this case. So I'm going to see a kind of a complete schedule from a 20-year need standpoint. This would be in sharp contrast to a property that was built, say, in 2008. So it's going to be newer. Those items are going to not necessarily be needing to be replaced as soon. And some things may or may not show up on the 20-year schedule. So if I put a 30-year roof on the property, that's not going to show up until 2038. So it's going to be on the tail end of my 20-year schedule. The refrigerators that I mentioned in my beginning, they're likely to be showing up in years 8, 9 of this particular PCA if I'm doing that. So anyway, just to get a general sense of what the property looks like and how the useful life is matching up. Then what I think are probably the most important pieces of any needs assessment, the pictures. The pictures provide a visual illustration of what I've been reading in the past. So if I've been reading about things, I want to see that the property is in good condition. What does that mean? You see the shingled roof there. I want to know how old are those shingles, and I can look at the picture and see, okay, well they look pretty good. I'm looking at the exterior brick walls. Looks like they've done some tuck pointing. So generally, I'm seeing maintenance that looks pretty good. So that's kind of marrying up with what my overall impression would be of the property. However, then I get into some of the things that may or may not have been reflected appropriately in the narrative. So in this case, I've got some pictures of the gatehouse. So while the picture here on the left of the gatehouse looks like it's in pretty good shape, then I have a picture of the interior on the right that shows that probably not in the best shape that we thought. So to the extent that I have not seen this included in the rehab that needs to be done at the property, that's going to be something that I'm going to want to see as a HUD reviewer. And certainly as an owner, you're going to want to take these recommendations from your PCA contractor, take them to heart and figure out what I need to do with that. In the bottom right-hand corner, I mentioned the trip hazards. So again, that trip hazard, that's a critical repair item. So when this shows up in the capital needs assessment, the expectation from HUD's point is that you as the owner are going out and fixing this trip hazard pretty much immediately after you see it. So if this is going to show up later on in your rehab schedule, you can expect some pushback from the recap staff into saying, well, this is something you really ought to take care of now. So let's not wait and do that later. Let's take care of this at this point in time. The second piece I wanted to touch on was just, again, a general snapshot of the energy audit. The energy audit, again, gives you, the owner, a picture of how is my property using utilities? How am I using energy, and how can I potentially be more efficient? So a snapshot of what the property currently is paying for utilities, that's going to be included in the energy audit. Then some sort of benchmarking tool. HUD has a very nice benchmarking tool that this particular contractor has used, where some data is entered in for any given site and location. And you can see I've blacked out the information, but the mapping location and the zip code gives a reference point for all HUD properties. And then this benchmark against kind of a HUD typical property. So you can see in my results section, this building scores a 1. A typical property is a HUD typical property is a 50. So in this particular case, this property is doing a very good job in their benchmark. I wanted to touch on the last piece here, which I mentioned earlier, is the right sizing. One of the critical pieces of the energy audit is for both the HVAC system and the hot water system to be right sized. So HUD really wants the correct unit sizes to be in all of their various properties. You find that in the last few years, a lot of studies have been done about this, and the old adage of, there's not too much, I want the biggest heat pump I can put in is not the best result often. You want something to be a little bit more efficient, and you find that from a maintenance standpoint in particular, overly sized units don't work properly, and you end up having more maintenance than you do for a right size. So undersized and oversized are equally as important. So you really want these to be right sized. How would I apply this to the results? Let's say I've just put in a new heating system maybe 5 years ago, and I get this energy audit that says I should be replacing it with something else. Do I have to do that? No, you don't have to do that. But what the energy audit and the CNA are basically going to say to you is, when you do replace it, you should be replacing it with something more efficient. Or with a really good energy audit, it's going to say, if you were to replace it now, here's how much you would save over time. And so then you as the owner can decide whether or not maybe it makes sense to go ahead and replace this HVAC system because it's performing so poorly. And this is just a more narrative description of kind of what I was just talking about. Replacing older heat pumps to a better SEER level is going to make things most comfort level as well as energy performance for your tenants. So something for you to consider as you're reading through this. This last piece that I wanted to show is something that I absolutely love that this contractor does. And basically what they do is they've created a table that kind of lists all of the various energy items that can exist at a property and gives a quick snapshot of what your property either has or doesn't have, and then any recommendations that they may want to make. So for example, if I scroll down and look at the HVAC system, or sorry, the hot water heater system starting in 19, 20, and 21, you see that you've got insulated hot water tanks already exist, and we would like to see what we might want to do better with that. And then it says, well, we actually can't do off-peak controls, so that is infeasible. So it's kind of gives you a quick snapshot of what might go on. Downsizing one of the bedroom types, that could be a benefit, and that's been recommended there. So again, a nice snapshot for you to take a look at. Okay. So what I want to do now is my original presentation, I actually had taken screenshots of the current eCNA tool, which is a Excel-based tool that the needs assessors complete, and they go through a variety of tabs, and then they upload that into the HUD eCNA web portal. But what I decided to do is, since we're at a point where we've got some beta testing going on the new e-tool, you all will get the benefit of seeing the new and improved version. So in August of this year, Recap in conjunction with multifamily production will be releasing a new version of the eCNA tool. So instead of the Excel-based tool that I gave you a quick snapshot of, we're going to be moving to a web-based portal. And so what I've pulled up is that actual portal. So this is the new web tool. This basically took all of the layout and information that was in the Excel-based tool and moved it over into a web platform that allows for more easy entry by the needs assessors, but more importantly, easier review by you, the PHA, and by HUD when the HUD staff need to do their reviews. And so what I wanted to do was spend a few minutes just kind of walking through this with you in kind of the new and improved form. For those of you who have use the older tool or have already procured a CNA that you're likely to get submitted in the next month or two, you will have used the old tool and you'll recognize some of these tabs, but the process for submitting is going to be slightly different, which we're not going to get into on this call. There'll be trainings later in the end of July, beginning of August on how this is going to work, but I did want to kind of give you a snapshot of what this looks like. So there's a series of tabs that I mentioned. All of these provide information kind of going from the kind of top down. So from less specific to more specific. So generally speaking, here's my CNA summary. Here's my property. Here's the ownership information. What's the assessment scope of work going to be? So when I click on the assessment, oh, great. All right, well, there we go. Luckily, I knew this was going to happen, and so I'm prepared for all failures. This is what happens when you try and do something on the fly. Bear with me while I log back in here. All right. So just like that, we're right back in. So the assessment scope, when we walk through this, you're going to, the needs assessor is going to provide some general information about where the property is located, what the sample size was, what they're required to do. One of the beauties of this particular new version of the CNA is the developer has built in a tremendous amount of checks and balances so that based on the answers that are given, the various requirements that are needed for the number of units that need to be inspected, the number of units that need to be accessible, and those sorts of things are all generated through the system, and will flag the contractor as they're going through to make sure that they're providing an adequate report to you as the client for this, and as HUD as the reviewer. So lots of information about kind of what the site looks like and what they've done. I'm going to skip over the participants. That's just a list of people who are interacting with this, and kind of drill into this more specifically. So now we kind of start building the property. So here's the site. The site has two different unit types. This particular site that I've built out only has one building, 16-story high-rise. You get a sense of if there are any common areas at the property. What's the parking look like? In this particular case, this is a high-rise, so there are only exterior spaces, but I could add garage parking. I'm going to have to tell it how many accessible parking spaces I have. So all of that information about parking is in there. The utilities, again, marrying up with the energy audit that's going to be done. There's some payback analysis that is done, some very simple payback analysis in here for you, the owner, to consider. So the energy information, so the utility users need to be listed in the costs there. Then the inspections, so every unit that gets inspected gets added here. So in this particular case, I've just entered a couple. This is going to be an issue because they have to do 25% of the units, and we haven't gotten anywhere near that. But that, again, that's going to be a flag that the needs assessor is going to see, and they're not going to be able to move forward without curing that. Then you get into what I consider to be the kind of the most fun piece, and the piece that is certainly the most informative for you, the user. A list of all of the components at the property. So again, I've just built this out to cover a couple of things, but I do want to show you what I've done. So let's just take a quick look at the refrigerators. So the needs assessor, again, you'll notice that I've logged in as the PHA. So I can only edit the items that have been checked here. All of these other things don't have an edit for me. I'm allowed to just react to what was put in here. So the needs assessor has done this work, and they've sent it back to me for my review to take a look at what they've seen and what they've recommended. So in this case, they've taken a look at the refrigerators, and you'll see that they've entered the refrigerators when they were installed. This nice piece here, where we've got a cost per use, is kind of what the cost of running these refrigerators is at any given time. And so we want to have these replaced. So what do I replace them with? How do I know what my choices are? Well, the needs assessor enters in for me alternatives. So in this particular case, the needs assessor has entered in an Energy Star refrigerator, which again, for the RAD program, all Energy Star appliances are required. So that's just part of being in the RAD program. But I also, and so the choice has been given to me, and I've been told, well, this is more energy efficient. So I can see that alternative right there, and that's what's been selected. So it's really nice for me to see that current use, current cost, and here's my usage per year, as opposed to my new usage per year is 150. So it gives me a sense of kind of what it is, what's the cost of operating. The cost of operating is going to go up slightly, but at the same time, over time, we're hopeful that the more energy efficient property components will be beneficial. So let's also take a look at, so these are items that, and this, just so that we're seeing this, these are recommended to be replaced now. So we're going to take a look at the timing of the replacements in a minute. I've also entered in windows. So I pull up the windows and I see these windows again were installed in 2000. They have a standard EUL of 30 years, okay, and they're currently 20 years old. So the needs assessor actually says that their assessed remaining useful life is only 7 years. So while the property, the general, formula says they have 10 more years on it, the needs assessor says, you know what, they're probably going to need to be replaced a little bit earlier. So that's something that you, as the owner, are going to want to consider. Well, where am I going to put that in the timing of my replacements? Then we also have, again, just like we did with the refrigerators, I've got an alternative here, the Energy Star windows that have been entered by the needs assessor for me to consider. Okay, so refrigerators, we're going to see those showing up in rehab. We need to replace those now. They have no remaining useful life. The windows showing up on the 20-year schedule. They have about 7 years left, so I'm going to see those on my 20-year schedule. And then lastly, we've got the roofs. So the roof at this property is just a flat concrete roof. Typically, it's going to last 100 years. It's currently 45 years old, so the standard remaining useful life is 55 years. The needs assessor said it's in pretty good shape, a few patches here and there. This is not going to show up on my 20-year schedule. So very expensive item. If you scroll down, you see they've estimated the cost at $1 million. So we're not going to have, but luckily we're not going to have to pay for that. So when you get your needs assessment back, this list will likely include 30 items, depending on kind of what all is at your property and what, but you would expect to see a longer list here of all the various components at the property. You don't need necessarily to see everything. For example, you're not going to be replacing the interior walls very often, so we're not going to expect to see those, although they can be entered, and I have seen that sometimes. But typically you're going to see things like insulation if the needs assessor through the energy audit saw an opportunity to add some more insulation or do something with the insulation at your site. So there's some flexibility here for the needs assessor and they're providing a report to you. So the next section here are the narratives and attachments. So the design of this is, instead of having the standalone narrative that I was showing you before, where we have a PDF of a report that's been typed up, the new design here is much more robust, so that the needs assessor can type in an executive summary. They can type in a purpose and scope, and you can see that here. They can attach additional reports, or if they didn't have enough space here, they could attach this section here. Most importantly, they can upload files, particularly pictures. Pictures are always required. And so down here, you can select where those pictures are uploaded. So for example, if I was the needs assessor and I had filled this out and I wanted to give a description of the elevators, and I also wanted to put a picture of the elevators, then I would do my description here. and then I would drop an attachment in here, and I would drop it in by narrative topic section. Okay, that's the selection that I would take, and then I would go ahead and upload that picture here, so that when you, as the PHA, are looking at this, there are pictures of the elevator and the recommendation of the work that they want to do. And then once you push this to HUD and the HUD reviewer gets it, they're seeing the same thing. So it's a very nice way for your contractor to get you the information that you need to make the decisions, take the recommendations or not, and then have the decision sent over to HUD for their review. So a very nice continuum there. Also on the financial factors page, this is where you will set up how you're going to pay for things. So you, the PHA, have the ability to update the information here. So how much are you going to put in annually? How much of an initial deposit are you going to make? Because you have to cover those needs at the property. Well, what are those needs? So we're going to go down and we're going to take a look at those. Oops, wait a minute. Sorry. So once I have finished looking through all of these various things, I did skip over this, the repair replace. So here are the repair replace recommendations. So the recommendation was made to you by the PCA contractor to replace these items. So you would go through and you make a decision about what you want to do and when you want to do it. So you're affirming what their recommendation is. And then once you've saved that and everything's all set, the results fall into this validation tab. And we're not going to worry about any of these flags because we're working through those bugs. But I do want to show you the resulting reports. So the resulting reports come out in two ways. First, the future needs. So this future needs shows all of the various items at the property. And so we have to go to the ones that I've entered. So we'll just stop here on the windows. And you'll see that I've entered the windows. They have 7 years left of initial 30-year. And so we can take a look and see what the recommendations are going to be and where that's going to show up. So we have a $206,000 cost, and we're going to do that work. Oops. I didn't affirm this, sorry. I didn't affirm that here. So we're going to do these now. All right. There we go. Now we're going to do that work. All right. There we go. So I've got my $206,000 that's getting done right now. All right. So then I've got to find, there was one other thing that I entered in here, my refrigerators. Here are my refrigerators. So here are my refrigerators. So they're past their EUL. We're going to do those in year 0 right here. Then they're going to show up again at their end of their EUL in year 15. So I've got to pay for those now and in year 15. So I've got to reserve enough money to cover those costs. Okay, and that's going to be showing up for every item that's been entered. So all of the various items that we've entered into our schedule that show up on the 20-year needs. How am I paying for that? Well, I'm paying for that by putting in money, right? So I'm making an initial deposit of $250,000, and that's how I'm going to pay for my $73,000 worth of work that is going to show up in year 15. So here's my work coming out, okay? That's how this is going to show. So once this eventually works, which is obviously not working today, once this eventually works, it will go through and show all of the beginning balances and things drawn out. So that's what's going to happen for you moving forward. So that's going to be a great way for you to see all of the various pieces that you need in order to take care of your property best possible way. Okay, so let's jump back to my slide presentation. All right. So, hired a needs assessor. They've gone out. They've done the needs assessment. What sort of things do I do as a PHA to interact with the needs assessors? So the first interaction is obviously going to be when you hire them and they come out to do their work. You're going to want to provide them with the necessary information for them for you to get the maximum benefit out of their report. So one of the things that Recap definitely recommends, and that most contractors will ask you once you hire them, is to provide them with maintenance records, capital expenditure records, any other studies and reports that you've done, so that they can compile all that information before they come out for the site inspection. Because all PCAs require a site inspection. And so the needs assessor wants to make sure that they're fully prepared when they come out. For example, if they're coming out to see an older property that you've done some rehab on, they want to see what rehab was done, the timing of that rehab, and then they can more adequately address whether or not there needs to be additional upgrades done, or whether in-kind replacements can be done, those sorts of things. They also want to get a sense of kind of how you are managing the property, so that they can find out, well, when you move over through the RAD conversion, you're going to be drawing things out of your capital account and not out of your operations and maintenance account. So we want to make sure that you understand that, and that they kind of give you some guidelines around that. They're also going to want to do some interviews and talk to people. So certainly your management team, the owner, manager, representative, definitely wants to talk to the needs assessor, but they're also going to want to talk to your maintenance staff. I know many of you PHAs have a nice maintenance staff, a group of folks that are working together. So you might have a lead at any particular property, or you might have a lead who's over all of your properties. So getting them in touch with those folks so that they can get a sense of kind of how you're maintaining your property. And then lastly, and not to be overlooked, and some contractors ask for this and others don't, and I wish more would, but also you might want to make available to the needs assessor any resident council members or resident leadership, so that they can talk to the tenants to find out, well, how is it to live here? If I'm looking at making some changes to the HVAC system or right-sizing the hot water heaters, it might be nice to know if the tenants are seeing any issues with that. Are they having trouble with the hot water? Is it too cold in the winter, or are the refrigerators not operating as efficiently as possible? Am I noticing that they're kicking on and off? Those sorts of things. That can be very beneficial. The more you share with the needs assessor, the more they're able to provide to you in your report. And then, as I mentioned, they're going to want to make sure that they understand your current practices. So what are you doing? I know a lot of PHAs, for example, only make changes to the units at unit turnover. So you're replacing the carpet at unit turnover. You're doing painting at unit turnover. You're potentially replacing older cabinetry at unit turnover. And what are the source of those funds? Are you using operating funds? Are you using capital funds? Are you using some combination of both? So the needs assessor will be able to give you a sense of, well, when you finish the RAD program, while you may have been doing some of these things in your operating account, this is going to shift over and be pulled out of your reserve account. That's why the reserve account is being set up. Okay. They're also going to potentially give you some improvements to the property, maybe some opportunities to do some energy efficient upgrades. One of the things that we have seen in the RAD program is the opportunity to potentially add some additional insulation. Some of the older properties, the insulation settled out, and there's some work going on at the property already. And don't forget about adding some insulation, because that'll help the comfort of your tenants and the performance of a lot of your appliances at that point in time. So we want you to make sure you're thinking about that. And lastly, and I've said it a couple times already, there needs to be a good line of communication between you and the needs assessor. You as the ownership team, your management team, you should present the challenges that you're having in managing your property. Present the upgrades that you might want to do, general improvements that you're looking at. It's a family property, and you've noticed that the playground is kind of not as great as you would like it to be. You really like to add a new playground and a swing set. Can the PCA contractor give you some ideas on what you might want to do there, or have they seen other situations like that? Similarly, on the HVAC systems, maybe you have a split system now, and should you go to a heat pump? Those sorts of general improvements, that sort of thing. And then just site-specific challenges. You're on a hill and you're having some drainage problems. What can be done about that? That would be something that you might want to consider. So one of the things that I wanted to do here is throw another poll in real quick. So Christina, you want to throw in the poll about how we're going to pay for something?
Yep, just
Great.
launched the poll. Also, just a quick heads up, we have a couple of questions in the queue when you're ready for them.
Great. Let's take a look at this poll real quick, and then I'll kick to the questions while people are asking. So I just wanted to get a sense of folks, when you finish your RAD conversion, replacing a refrigerator is going to come out of a different place. So go ahead and start answering your questions on this. And before I go to the next slide, let's pause and have some answers to some questions. So go ahead, Christina, shoot me. Christina, you there?
Yep.
Okay.
Erica, do you have the questions lined up?
Me now?
Yep,
Hey,
we
Erica.
can hear you now.
All right, perfect. Okay, so we have a few questions here.
Perfect.
First one is, my housing authority completed the CNA earlier this year, and we have not uploaded a CNA. Is this something we could request TA for?
Sure, absolutely. You can go on the resource desk and request TA to have somebody take a look at the CNA that you've got in the past and see whether or not it's going to be compliant and what upgrades need to be done. Absolutely. Yes, for sure.
Okay, great. All right, next question is, does this assessment history apply to new construction in a development where the existing units will be demolished?
So so that's a great question and a nuance here. So my presentation here is just talking about general PCAs and kind of existing properties that are going to go through the RAD program. If you're going through RAD and you are demolishing your existing building and building back new, there's no need for a PCA. So there's a list of exempt activities that are exempt from doing a PCA, and that's one of them. So if you're tearing down and building new, you don't need to do a PCA. Similarly, if you're doing like a gut rehab down to the studs where you're pretty much ripping everything out and starting over, you don't have to do a PCA for that either. What you do have to do in both of those cases is you need to fill out the tool part so that the scope of work is created. So right now, the Excel tool allows for items to be entered and then a scope of work to be produced. And then the 20-year needs come from that. So that still needs to be done because Recap needs the scope of work established and then the 20-year budget. So kind of what you're going to need for the reserve for replacement. But the procuring of a complete PCA, including the narrative and the energy audit, is not required for a new construction or a substantial rehab property as well.
Okay, great. And Robert, I have a 3-part question here.
Awesome.
On IDRR/ADRR. Okay.
Yep.
So I'll read them one at a time.
Okay.
Can you explain the flexibilities between sizing the IDRR and ADRR amounts?
Okay, let's come back. So I'm going to put a pin in this because the next section is going to talk about that.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay.
All right, so let's see. If we're going to talk about that next, maybe we'll skip the next question. Okay, so how about this? For this whole question, maybe we kind of recircle back after that section.
That sounds good.
All right, we'll move on to the next one. What cost factor is used in the new HUD CNA e-tool software that is being presented in this session? What cost factor is being used in the new HUD CNA e-tool software?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. I don't know what they're referring to from a cost factor standpoint. If they're referring to what does HUD use to quote unquote estimate the cost of the particular items, HUD doesn't actually do that. The needs assessors do that. Typically they use RS means or another national database program to but HUD doesn't endorse any sort of cost model So if that's the question, that's the answer to that. If not, if they can clarify the question, I'm happy to answer more.
Okay, I'll leave this one up so we
Perfect.
can type a response for later.
Okay.
All right, next question is, will there be an inflation rate for the replacement of refrigerators, in parentheses, in the future years factored in?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. There's a standard. I jumped over that very quickly, but in the financial factors tab, there's a place where the HUD recommended inflation rate is put in, and so yes, it's typically typically 2%, and that inflates over the life of the 20-year schedule.
Okay, gotcha. Do you want a few more? We have about 5 or 6 more questions to go.
All right, let me get to the next through the next piece, because that'll get that one question about, I hope, ADR and IDRR, and then I'll save enough room. I've got about 7 minutes left, so I'll save enough room at the end.
Okay, perfect.
So, okay.
Thank you.
And look at that. What a great group. So we got 61% of you got this right. So the question about replacing a refrigerator, it's going to come out of the reserve for replacement account. Absolutely. We're not going to be replacing refrigerators out of our annual maintenance expense anymore. That's kind of the old way. So you're going to want to be doing draws for capital items such as refrigerators out of the reserve for replacement costs. Okay, and you're not going to do a one-time capital cost because you've got a reserve account. You don't need to do a draw against capital. So hopefully that's a good answer for everybody. All right, so pulling it all together. So Erica's question that she was reading is a nice segue into where we're going next. So how does the PCA impact your project? So I've alluded to it a couple of times. Depending on what the PCA costs come out at, you may need to adjust what you were thinking about doing. There have been a great number of PHAs who have come into the RAD program thinking they weren't going to do any rehab, got a PCA, and were like, oh my gosh, I had no idea I needed to do this much work. And so they've had to readjust their plans. So lots of times they have to go out and borrow some money. Sometimes they have to do tax credits. Or every once in a while, a PHA may have enough money in their reserves to where they can take old previous year's operating and capital reserves and put them into the transaction to cover the rehab costs, as well as the initial deposit to the reserve account. But again, the PCA is critical to setting this up for you so that you can see how much things are going to cost and then how am I going to pay for those things. Again, this chart just kind of shows what things look like. So as the costs of rehab increase, likelihood of funding also changes. So, lower cost of rehab, the PHA is likely to be able to fund most of those things. But as things go up, state, federal, and local grants, those sorts of things, conventional financing, FHA financing, low-income housing tax credits, kind of on the more expensive side. So depending on what sort of work you're thinking about doing, you're going to have to potentially do some different financing. So setting up kind of our reserve balances. All of the capital needs over the 20 years have got to be covered. So I want to make sure that we're clear. So the needs assessor is going to go through and look at all of the items at your property and kind of where they fall in the 20-year schedule. And then you as a PHA, your job in sizing this is to make sure that all those costs are covered. You can't have a 20-year schedule that the reserve balance goes negative in any given year. There are a couple of exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, no negative balances in the 20-year schedule. Sometimes in years 11 and further, there's a potential to do that, but you really should be thinking about how am I sizing this to cover all those years. So how would I do that? One way is to provide a lump sum, so that initial deposit. So the more I put in initially, the less I'm going to have to put in over time. Okay, that helps increase your cash flow. Okay, because you've put more money in up front, and I've got an illustration of that in a minute. But then setting the annual deposit, if you have a very large spread of costs, so there's no one year where there's a big bump up in costs, maybe you can do a smaller initial deposit and a more consistent annual deposit that will cover things. Basically, what you end up seeing when you do a PCA, depending on the age of the property, is it's kind of peaks and valleys. So things tend to go in a cycle. So if I've got a big if I've got windows and roofs all replaced in 1 year, say that's year 8, then in years 9, 10, 11, and 12, I don't have a lot of draws. So my balances are kind of having a chance to refresh and replenish themselves. But if I didn't put enough up initially, then I'm not going to be able to cover those costs. And so that's kind of where you get into the balancing back and forth. So as an illustration of that, we'll take 2 scenarios. Both cases, I have $5 million of needs over the next 20 years. In the scenario 1, I don't put in an initial deposit, and I've got a pretty flat spread, so there's no really steep peak. So I do an ADR of $250,000 a year over the next 20 years. That covers my $5 million. I'm golden, no problem. But what if I want more cash flow, or need to borrow money, or have some money that I can set aside first? What can I do? Well, in the example on the right, basically, I take half of the 20-year needs and make an initial deposit to the reserve account of $2.5 million, and then that halves my annual deposit. So I've increased my cash flow, by $125,000 simply by putting that money in upfront. So that's something that most good needs assessors can kind of help you with. Again, it goes back to the communications thing. If you're being honest with them, then they can give you the best advice moving forward. Okay, so I've got a couple of minutes left. Erica, hopefully I got the question about ADR and IDRR, but if not, what have you got for me on those?
Okay, great. So yeah, the question was can you explain the flexibilities between the sizing IDRR and ADRR amounts?
Right, so there's no there's no preconceived notion by HUD that you're going to do a percentage either way. So this example that I've given here, you could just as easily have put $5 million in for the initial deposit and 0 in for the ADRR. So you have whatever your balance, whatever works for you, that's where you want to find it.
Okay, so yeah, like the question in parentheses was, can you have a lesser IDRR if the ADRR is more than $450 a unit standard?
Well, I think they're conflating some things there. So that $450 a unit, again, is not a quote unquote standard. What the $450 unit number is a way for newer properties, so properties built within the last 5 years, to forego the need for a PCA. So, so just to be clear, most RAD projects need a PCA, but if your property was built in the last 5 years, or you're using tax credits, and you're going to do $450 a unit in your ADRR, then you don't have to do a PCA. But that $450 a unit is not a preconceived number. Other than that, it's just a threshold number. Okay.
And then the third part of this is are there any other considerations that should be made when doing a straight RAD conversion with a rehab to follow in a few years?
Yeah, so you've got to be very careful, because we've seen this a fair amount. A PHA that comes in the RAD program thinking that they're going to do a quote unquote straight RAD conversion, a RAD-o-matic, whatever the term of art is at the moment, and then they're going to deal with their necessary rehab in a few years. That oftentimes doesn't actually fly, because the rehab that they want to put off in the next couple of years actually is rehab that the PCA is showing needs to be done now or in the first couple of years. And for Recap and RAD, now in the first couple of years are the same thing. So anything that's showing up rehab for next year or year 2, Recap's going to want to see that moved into rehab. So there's really no opportunity, shouldn't be an opportunity for a property that needs rehab today or in the next year or so to actually convert and then deal with that in the next couple of years. So that opportunity shouldn't exist.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, and then our next question on the cost factor that we had punted to later, you actually did answer it. So our friend Jamar Joseph said that based on the response that you provided, the assessor will provide the cost factor for each of the items listed in the ECNA tool. So we're just going to mark that as answered. And how are we doing on time? We have a few more questions. Okay.
Have you got an easy one I could end with?
Let's see. Does the model factor in inflations in the out years?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. So what we'll do is Robert, we have these questions there in the
Sure.
Q&A box. I think that you can answer these in written form as well.
Great.
In addition to, again, maybe they can be picked up later down the road. So these
Okay.
will be here, and we will make sure to transfer whatever's been in the chat into the Q&A. But again, as a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A box so they can be addressed verbally or or written.
Great. And I will take a look at those now. So thanks everybody for your time. We appreciate it. And Christina, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thank you, Robert. So now we are actually moving to a 10-minute break. So feel free to grab a snack, check emails, and we will see you here at 2:20 Eastern Time. For anybody still with us, feel free to spend your break time over in the advice booth. You should have the links in the chat box or also on the resource desk. Well, welcome back, everybody. We are preparing to go into our next panel here for the next hour. It's going to go over conversion strategies. And that's going to be presented by Carol Williams-Keefe. Kara, do you want to put up your PowerPoint slides?
Sure thing. Let me go ahead and share the screen.
Great, thanks.
All right. All right. Are we good to start, or you want to hang on for a minute or two?
I think we're good to start.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kara Williams-Keefe. I'm a branch chief in the Office of Recapitalization. And today I will be presenting on conversion strategies, and we'll be focusing on financing, site aggregation, and portfolio awards. I believe I have a few polls sprinkled throughout, and I'll be taking questions towards the end of the presentation. All right, so when converting to RAD, the program is indifferent to how you finance your conversion, as long as the conversion can meet the program's basic underwriting test. And that is that the converting project must demonstrate that it can meet the 20-year capital needs, identified through a third-party CNA, and otherwise generally show a cash flow of $12 per unit per month, or in the case of leveraged transactions, a debt coverage of at least 1.11. And to meet those needs, there are generally 3 different types of financings that we'll be going over today, and those are no debt transactions, debt-only transactions, and tax credit transactions. But before we jump into that, I think it's helpful to see how the RAD program breaks down by numbers. So this is a quick snapshot of RAD conversions to date. And as you can see, almost half of the conversions have been done so as no debt deals. 40% have been financed with tax credits, and just in the minority, about 13% have been financed with just debt only. And so looking at the side that was financed with tax credits, just a quick little breakdown within that, 4% tax credits converted about 30% of those, and 9% tax credits converted about 9% of those. And so, what does this translate to as far as doing work in relation to your CNA? Overwhelmingly, 75% of the RAD conversions are doing some kind of rehab. 16% for whatever reason is doing no rehab, and then we do have a small number that are able to put together financing that can do new construction deals. So we're first going to talk about no debt transactions. And so what do we mean by a no debt? A no debt means that a PHA isn't using any permanent financing to support the transaction. There's a misconception sometimes that this means that the PHA is doing no work, but that's not necessarily so. There are plenty of PHAs that have no debt transactions that are able to complete work with just their public housing funds. So it's just a little nuance to keep in mind. No debt transactions can have any number of funding sources. That includes existing public housing funds, local and sometimes state grants, and other soft funds that are subject to cash flow. And so you can use public housing funds, which is great about RAD, to help support your conversions. So you can use it as a source of capital in the development budget to support the rehab if you're doing new construction. And you can also use it to increase your contract rents, which is sometimes very helpful. The one thing that you'll hear me say several times throughout this presentation is that any public housing funds that you're using must be identified in the financing plan and the RCC. Once a PHA converts through RAD, it is out of the public housing program and it cannot use public housing funds after that point. So if you want to use it, make sure you earmark it. So when we say public housing funds, what are we talking about? So PHA can use existing operating reserves. They're existing capital funds, any replacement housing factor funds or demo and dispo transitional funds, and in some cases, Section 18 disposition proceeds can also be used. And you're using public housing funds, so there are some restrictions that the program does put on them. The first one is that if the PHA is contributing their public housing funds as a loan, it must be structured as a soft second mortgage payable from project cash flow. It can't be hard debt. Additionally, another thing to keep in mind is that when a PHA is closing out of their public housing program, it should definitely bring over all of its remaining public housing funds. Again, once it converts, PHA can't go back and ask for any public housing funds that were left on the table. So it goes right back to Treasury. And in some cases, PHAs are allowed to take some financing proceeds, but there are restrictions on that. And if the big one is that if you're using any public housing funds in your sources, the PHA is not allowed to take any proceeds. So Streamline small PHA conversions. This was something that was introduced in our supplemental notice in between revision 3 and revision 4, and it's been implemented in revision 4 as well. And we think of these as no debt transactions as well, even though they're a very small subset. This option for small PHAs is for PHAs with 50 units or less, and they're not doing any rehab. And so therefore they are not getting they're not going out and getting any debt. So it is considered a no debt transaction. The nice thing about these small PHA streamlined conversions is that it requires a modified financing plan submission. And the big thing is that it doesn't require a CNA or an e-tool. So it really frees up money and provides some flexibility to the smaller PHAs that want to convert to RAD. There are also MTW agencies, moving to work agencies. And this is another form of public housing funds. And MTW agencies can use their public housing funds and voucher funds under funding flexibilities and can be added as a source of capital to support your conversions. The funds can be provided as a loan, a grant, a capital contribution, but we keep saying it has to be identified. I would say more times than not, though, we see MTW agencies using their authority to augment the conversions rents versus using them as capital funds. So something to keep in mind. And Robert sort of touched on this in his presentation towards the end, but it's worth bringing up again. So future recapitalization. So, you know, many PHAs convert as no debt transactions now. They are able to either accomplish the capital needs that they need to do to convert now with, you know, public housing funds only. And, you know, they're comfortable with that. They know that they can meet their 20-year schedule and their reserves. So they're not, you know, in any rush to do anything more immediate now. The program doesn't prohibit the PHA at a later date to go ahead and refinance and recapitalize and take out some proceeds and put it back in the project and maybe address some of the items that they didn't really move up on the priority list at conversion. So it's definitely allowed. You know, you're not stuck as a no debt transaction for the rest of the project's life. You can do as you see fit and responsible for the project for the long term. One point to make, though, is that any future post-conversion approvals for a refinance or recapitalization isn't going to come through the RAD office. You're going to come to us for other things for that request, but not for any review of or approval of the refinance recapitalization. That will be going through the PIH office if you converted with PBVs, or the multifamily housing office if you converted to PBRA. So you would be following different programmatic rules at that time. So debt-only transactions, which you can see was, you know, a minority of the transactions that have converted to date in RAD, but it's an important one. So a debt-only transaction is one that includes permanent debt, but it doesn't include the use of low-income housing tax credits. So permanent debt or often referred to as hard debt. It requires monthly debt service payments, and they are made by commercial, conventional lenders or FHA insured mortgage lenders. Again, just to put it out there, PHAs are prohibited from using public housing funds as hard debt. So it really has to be coming from a commercial or conventional lender or an FHA insured mortgage lender. So we often hear, PHAs being nervous or turned off about taking on debt to address capital needs. It's something that, PHAs are unfamiliar with. It's not something that they've had to do as they've run their agency. But there are benefits to leveraging debt, and it shouldn't be something that a PHA should just discount right away. So a PHA can choose to take on debt to either increase the amount of capital available to complete the required repairs. So those are the repairs in the year of conversion that your CNA identifies. It can also increase the amount of capital available to complete larger scopes of work. So, let's say you're looking at your CNA and in the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to have to be pulling a lot out and doing work. Maybe it makes sense if your property can support it to take out debt to, do more work than you need to do in order to get ahead of your capital needs, and maybe provide a project that's, a little more spruced up for the residents. It can also help fund your reserves, so your IDRR, any operating reserves. It can also pay off any existing debt that the PHA has, such as CFFP and EPC. So the basics of using debt. Conversions are eligible for financing from both private and public lending sources. Financing must be subordinate to the RAD use agreement, and this includes any mixed finance projects that already have existing lenders in the mix. And many sources of funding are found at the seller, local, state, and federal level, and they can be structured as debt. They can also be structured as grants or cash flow notes within your sources. So what are the types of debt that we see? Pointed out, we have the traditional lenders, the FHA insured mortgage lenders. There's also CDFIs and GSEs. We see a lot of federal home loan bank loans, CDBG home funds, housing trust funds are also another biggie. And then we see a lot of state and local funds. A lot of localities have their own pot of funds that PHAs can apply for and utilize. And then there's always seller financing. And in rare occasions, but we have seen it, private foundation financing. So when a PHA is taking on permanent debt, your transaction manager will be reviewing the term sheets that your lender will provide you. And so what we'll be looking at to make sure is that there is a fixed rate of interest for a fixed term, that the loan is fully amortized over no more than 40 years. We do allow balloon payments, but they can't incur until after the earlier of the expiration of the HAP contract or 17 years from the date of permanent debt. We really want to make sure that the project is covered by the loan for as much of the HAP contract term as we can get. And the project should also not have a debt service coverage of less than 1.1, or if the lender requires a different amount, we can look at that and decide if that's acceptable. So FHA insured debt is a great option to also look into. FHA mortgage insurance provides high leverage and long-term, fully amortized fixed rate financing at very competitive rates. And it can be a lifeline for some PHAs to make projects, pan out. The two most common FHA products are 223Fs and 224D4s. We also have seen some risk-sharing programs that are offered through the state housing finance agencies and Freddie Mac or Fannie used, but they're not a huge portion of what we see. The nice thing also with FHA insured debt is that you can layer on other sources of financing. So you can still use tax credits and other public sources of funding to help make your transaction financially viable. So just to go back into the whole proceeds question, because this does actually come up a lot, and it is a tricky, it is a tricky nuance within the underwriting that, you know, we do look at, and sometimes can, you know, sort of be a shock when we go back to the PHA and tell them that they can't take proceeds. But so it's good to remember that you can receive acquisition proceeds in excess of any seller financing that the PHA is providing. But the PHA can't be using any of their public housing funds. So if they're not using public housing funds, they can take the acquisition proceeds. But they can't take the acquisition proceeds and put it in their pocket and walk away. They come with the restriction that it must be used for affordable housing purposes. And until it's expended, the PHA places those funds in a general depository agreement at their RAD closing. So oftentimes, if there are proceeds, PHAs will use it and hold on to it and put it towards another future RAD conversion, and to help, you know, be a source of financing in a future conversion. So that is a good way to put it towards, you know, affordable housing purposes. So now we're going to jump into tax credit transactions, which, you know, is a huge bulk of what we see and what we review. This is not going to be a detailed tax credit, you know, training. This is going to be very, you know, 1,000-foot view of it. But it is an important source, and it does provide equity to really make some spectacular projects at the end of the day. So tax credit financing or tax credit equity. PHAs can choose to use tax credit financing because the capital needs are too great and the debt alone can't provide enough funds to complete those repairs. You know, that's what Robert was saying. You know, you get your capital needs report back and it's beyond what you had even anticipated. You know, the other thing is that tax credits can generate excess equity, so you can do larger scopes of work voluntarily. You know, if you see an opportunity to, you know, really transform a community or transform a project site, you know, tax credits can be a great way to use equity to do that. So these are the common types of tax credits. There are 9% low-income housing tax credits. Those are offered annually by state housing finance agencies, and they're very competitive. Then there are 4% low-income housing tax credits, which are rolling or sometimes called, you know, by right tax credits, and they're often non-competitive. Well, not often, they're always non-competitive. So, you know, we'll see a lot more 4% come through than 9%, but both offer a decent amount of equity based on your underwriting. There are also historic tax credits that we've seen some PHAs use for public housing properties that have been classified as historic. And recently, we have seen some PHAs dip their toes into opportunity zone tax credits, but as far as I know, we haven't proceeded past just sort of talking about it and conceptualizing how it would work. I don't think we've actually closed a deal utilizing opportunity zone tax credits, since that's so new. So tax credit financing, you know, it can be a bear to do, and it's very complicated and it is very costly. And, you know, we really encourage PHAs to know the local politics and to know the priorities in the Housing Finance Agency annual QAPs. You know, there are excessive annual demands for 9% tax credits, more than the states can provide. And so, you know, PHAs don't really, not even PHA projects don't apply to those if they don't think that they can get them. So we'll see less of those. Where on the flip side, states routinely don't fully allocate their supply of 4% and tax exempt bonds. And so it's a lot easier to move through the process of getting a 4% tax credit allocations. You know, we really encourage PHAs to assess the local demand and supply considerations before jumping into doing tax credits. And, you know, we also recommend, you know, tapping into other sources of expertise. Development partners are great for this in helping a PHA, you know, do a financial analysis of what is more beneficial in going after tax credits. A PHA must indicate in its RAD application if it intends to use the tax credits, but there's no requirement to have those tax credits allocated at the time of application. They will have to be allocated by the time of your RAD approval and RCC. So existing mixed finance projects. So these are, they're interesting in the fact that these are public housing projects that went through the mixed finance program, and they were previously developed in conjunction with low income housing tax credits. And so therefore they already involve existing outside investors and owners and lenders. And so they can be a little tricky. We've had some PHAs get tripped up in wanting to convert, but their lenders and investors and syndicators had no interest. And so they can be a funny subset of RAD transactions. Mixed finance conversions can be all three. We've seen it run across the scale. They can convert as no debt, they can convert as debt, or they can convert as tax credits. So we've seen all sort of, we've seen mixed finance deals go through all of those. The biggie in why there's often a lag in sort of getting the existing lenders and investors on board is because the existing lenders need to subordinate to the RAD use agreement. So even though they're existing and they've been there before us, they still have to subordinate. So that is the end of the finance discussion. Did I totally miss one of the polls? Erica, Christina?
Yes, so we have, we still have the polls if you'd like to go back and do them.
Sorry, I just got really eager. Do we have one for site aggregation?
Let me see. We do, I believe. Let me just pick out which one it is.
Thanks.
All right, I'm hoping the correct one is coming up.
All right.
Here we go.
So here's the poll. Does RAD allow for multiple sites to be combined into a single conversion? Yes, whatever works to secure financing. We're flexible. Not always, and it's dependent on the size and location of project sites, or no, a conversion is always a single project site. So that is the poll to see where everybody's at. All right. So should I just keep going, Christina, until those are tallied?
Yeah, we can wait another 15 seconds or so. We've got quite a few responses already.
Okay, I'll give it a go.
All right, I think we'll close the poll in about 5 seconds. So. Right. Okay, share the results.
Great. Dead heat. All right, so 46% of you said yes, whatever works. 44% said not always, and 10% said no. So the answer is not always, and it's dependent on size and location of project sites. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section, so you all can understand better what we mean by site aggregation and project definition. Awesome, thank you. All right, so site aggregation. Ooh, there we go. So when we talk about site aggregation, we're talking about varying project sites being combined into one CHAP and one financing plan, which we see often done. And so I think it's always a good reminder to review what RAD defines a project as. So it's a bit of a lengthy definition, but I'll go ahead and read it. And so For purposes of determining a RAD transaction, a project is a structure or group of structures that in HUD's determination are appropriately managed as a single financial asset. In most cases, this corresponds to a grouping of residential units that are managed and marketed as a single entity and are geographically proximate. In determining whether multiple structures constitute a project, HUD will take into account types of buildings, occupancy, location, market influences, management organizations, financing structure, or other factors as appropriate. So it's a mouthful, but basically, we want to make sure that if it's a grouping of separate sites, that it makes sense. And so because of that, this is just sort of a very loud public service announcement. It is imperative that a PHA consult the RAD team prior to financing being secured to receive conditional approval on the site groupings. Often we see PHAs put together groupings that, to HUD wouldn't make the most sense from both a management perspective and a locality perspective. And, it can cause some heartburns amongst all of the partners involved. And in some cases, we've had to unwind projects in order to have the deal meet the RAD definition. So it's something that PHAs and their development partners should be very aware of and thinking about as they're looking at RAD transactions. And so, we RAD, we're always available to sort of brainstorm and go through that with PHA. So a PHA can either use request technical assistance and, a team member will be assigned. They can also email the Rad Resource Desk, and the Rad Resource Desk can put them in touch with, one of the branch chiefs within RAD, and we can all talk it through to make sure what's being decided on is good for all parties. The standards that we use can be found in PIH Notice 2006-10, and we rely on that notice because it determines what constitutes a single manageable marketable entity as closely to the RAD definition as it exists. And so what that notice says is that non-contiguous sites of 80 or more units that are not proximate to another site should be expected to be its own project and to be financed as a separate transaction. So this is saying that if you have a grouping of projects and one of the sites is, 100-unit tower, and the other projects are all, less than 80 units, you should expect that that tower should be on its own and financed by itself, and not included in the grouping of the smaller units. The reasoning for this is that the smaller units and smaller buildings, benefit from being grouped together from a cost basis, where a larger size property can often stand on its own and be able to carry financing on its own. And so this is really, when it comes down to it, this is what we're looking to when making that decision. And so before you submit your financing plan and you're going through these discussions with the RAD team, this is what we're going to be asking to see from you all. We're going to ask for a site map for the proposed grouping. We want to see where they're located. We want to see distances between the two. We want to see community boundaries is always really helpful. And then we also want to see a map of the remaining public housing units. We want to see where other buildings are located to maybe tease out if there's a better grouping that's available out there. We also want to see if there are, any physical barriers, highways, rivers, parks, county lines sometimes that are dividing all of these units apart. And then finally, we really want to see management and oversight narratives. We want to know, okay, you're proposing this grouping. How are you going to manage a high-rise tower and scattered site single-family homes? How can you manage that as a single entity? How are you going to do the annual financials for those? If you have an elderly building that you want to combine with a family building, how are you going to market and manage those with two different occupancy types? So we really want to see some thought behind it from the operational side. So just as a reminder, recap will determine if the request is reasonable. So please don't go into it assuming that we won't question it, and necessary, and to consider whether other groupings might be appropriate. Like we said, we may dive into that with you all. And if you are doing FHA or PBRA transactions, we might just be the first step. You will also have to have separate approval from FHA if they consider it a manageable or marketable area, and OAMPO and the asset management team will also have to make that determination. And so sometimes visuals are helpful. These are totally made up just to show, sort of what we're talking about. So here you have 3 sites, all are less than 80 units. There are no physical barriers, and all 3 are less than a mile apart. Great. We would love to see this done. This gives us no heartburn. And so then we get a little trickier. All right. So now we have 4 project sites. Still, all of them are less than 80 units, but there is a physical barrier. There is a huge Highway 287, and there's also a very large park that's dividing 3 of the sites from 1 of the sites. We would probably sit down and discuss this with you and look at your maps just to make sure that this is logical and there are no other combinations that can be done. But most likely we would be okay with this once we got comfortable with how the PHA had thought through it. And lastly, we get to the one that we would most likely push back on you. So here we have, again, 4 sites. 3 of them are all under 80 units, and 1 is just above 80 units at 95. So we have that one single site, that outlier. And then we have a group of projects that are less than 80 units. There are still physical barriers between the 3 projects that are less than 80 units. There's still that highway there. And although those projects are now less than a mile, that site A, that 95 unit one, is much more than a mile. So most likely we will come back to you and say, you know what, we can get comfortable with the 3 being grouped, but that one site, that 95 unit site, is going to have to stand on its own. Please pull it out. So those are just some visuals of how Recap looks at and analyzes site groupings. All right, so I think I have another poll.
Yes, let me pull it up. Okay, just launched it.
Awesome. Okay, so how can a PHA reserve units within its public housing portfolio? Can they reserve it with a multi-phase award, a portfolio award, or both?
We've got quite a few that responded. I'm just going to wait till the responses slow down. Here are the results.
All right, awesome. So we have 15% said multi-phase awards, 24% said portfolio awards, and 61% said both. So this was a bit of a trick question for us RAD nerds, because it used to be both. Before Rev 4, you were able to use both multi-phase and portfolio awards. And with Rev 4, we've gotten rid of multi-phase awards, and everything now is just a portfolio award. So great, awesome. All right, so portfolio awards. Whoop. All right, so just as I said, that the portfolio, we've moved away from multi-phase awards and moved towards portfolio awards. This has been memorialized in the RAD Notice Revision 4. And so PHAs that wish to implement like multi-phase rehabs or redevelopments of public housing sites, you can now do so under the portfolio award restructure. So from an admin perspective, from the RAD side, it's just a lot easier to manage one award than 2 awards. And so a portfolio award is an award that allows a PHA to reserve RAD conversion authority for a set of projects, also including multiple phases for large-scale redevelopments, and it locks in the applicable contract rent in the year of application. So it is a way for PHAs to reserve a lot of units within their PHA portfolio under one award, and that the PHA can use as needed throughout several years. And so, you know, it's a good way for the PHA who's still working out how to, you know, strategically work through their portfolio. It allows you to have a bunch of units at your fingertips right away. So, you know, sort of what I just alluded to, the nice thing about the portfolio awards is that it does offer greater flexibility in planning the conversions. PHAs can substitute projects in the portfolio award and switch projects between active and pending ones. You know, it's like, it can be a game of, you know, chess almost in trying to figure out what works best when. And having a portfolio award allows you to do that. Where multi-phase awards were a little tricky because they were project site specific. Here, this is just unit specific. So, you know, you may have a portfolio award for a couple hundred units, and you may have one for a couple thousand units. And, you know, you can use them as you need to in order to move through your conversions. For PHAs that are existing and have been in the RAD program before and had multi-phase awards, you've already been automatically converted to a portfolio award. So your multi-phase award no longer exists. Your portfolio award is what is active now on the Rad Resource Desk and what is sort of driving your units. And the final date for a PHA to apply for their final units in their portfolio award is September 30th, 2024. So, you know, if you have a portfolio award right now, you've got 4 years to move through it and get them all converted. You know, and that can be daunting, right? If you've got a couple thousand units in a portfolio award, I mean, like I said, it's hard to know where to start. And so, you know, Recap really just wants to see progress. I think, you know, we don't want to see PHAs, you know, sit there on a bunch of units that could otherwise be given to other PHAs that could move through them very quickly. But we also want to see PHAs convert as many units as possible. So, you know, although we have the authority to revoke revoke authority under the portfolio award for projects that, you know, haven't been given chaps for, you know, I think ultimately what weighs more on us when we're looking at these awards is seeing progress. We want to see that the PHA is actively thinking about their portfolio, actively applying for financing, that they're actively doing all of their due diligence that they need to do, that they're getting their CNAs done and all of that. You know, often with portfolio awards, you'll have a TM assigned to you who will be, you know, sort of keeping tabs on your progress, and that's what we want to see. We want to see PHAs successfully moving their units over and repositioning their assets. Okay, did I have any more polls after this one?
That was the last one.
That was the last one. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So this is the last slide. I know I'm a little early. I talk fast, but some final thoughts on financing and conversion strategies. You know, pulling financing together can be very complicated. It can also be very costly and very time consuming. And so, you know, you'll probably hear it throughout some of the other presentations if you haven't heard it already, but development partners are a great ally to PHAs, you know, whether they're turnkey, fee, or going to be a part of, you know, an ownership structure. They can really be a value add to a RAD conversion, especially if a PHA doesn't have the experience or the capacity to do one of these. You know, a PHA may feel comfortable and have the capacity to do a debt conversion, But, I think to do a tax credit conversion, there's a lot involved in that. And so don't be scared to reach out and seek out, subject expertise in these financing scenarios from development partners. We have seen very successful partnerships throughout the term of the RAD program. And so, what I think a development partner can help with, and also just something that the PHA should think about if a developer partner doesn't, isn't what they want, is to know what you have. You really need to understand the capital needs of the project. Just, back to Robert's presentation, you really have to know what you have. And you need to identify sources of funds. Sources of funds, there's no free money out there. You're gonna have to actively search for it, actively apply for it, and to know what's available, what's not available, what best fits your project is really important. And the experience of development partners can really help there to strategize the best site aggregations that are, that would be the most financial viable, to really understand how projects in different communities can be used and leveraged. Again, this is something the PHA should know about their own communities, but a developer can sort of see it from a different perspective and offer additional thoughts. And finally, to manage the units in a portfolio award. Like I said, you can swap them, you can move them in, move them out, use them as you need to. And it is a game of chess sometimes. And I think, a developer sometimes is able to offer a different perspective and can see things a little differently. So don't think that they're not a value add. A PHA is definitely capable of doing all of these things, but sometimes having another set of eyes is always helpful. So those are my final thoughts. And so I think we have plenty of time for questions. If we want to go ahead and move into that.
Hi, Carol. We don't have any questions at this moment, but just as a reminder, while I guess I'm here, please put your questions in the Q&A box if you have any for Kara, or raise your hand as well if you want to be unmuted. So, Jaime Bordnave, do you want to be unmuted? All right, I'm going to unmute Jaime since we know who that is.
Great.
Or actually, Christina, would you be able to unmute Jaime?
Yep, let's see.
And I concurred with that being unmuted.
There we go.
We go.
Okay, Kara, thank you for a good presentation. Quick question for you on the ability of authorities to take out proceeds from a transaction if there are capital funds involved. Can you distinguish between a transaction that is not the last transaction of converting their portfolio and the last transaction in their portfolio? Any distinction there?
As far as taking proceeds?
Yes.
So if it is the last project, so if these are the last units in your public housing portfolio, you do get some perks. One of them being the acquisition proceed rules don't apply. So you are able to, at that time, acquisition proceeds, even if you're using your capital funds. And that's because, we don't want you to leave any of your public housing funds on the table. We don't want that to go back to Treasury. So inevitably you're going to be bringing that over, and we don't want to ding you for that and not let you take out proceeds. So that there is that one distinction. Thank you.
Okay. And would they still, those funds would still need to go into a depository agreement if it's the last transaction?
As far as I understand, yes.
And if an authority is going from, say, 400 units, doing a 150 unit RAD deal, and the rest of their portfolio they've got lined up and approved for a Streamline voluntary conversion, but they haven't pulled the trigger on that yet, would that still be all right to take the proceeds funds.
No, you have to have approval from SAC in order to have those 150 units considered your last units.
Okay, have to have approval, but not necessarily pulled the trigger on the Section 18 or Section 32 conversion?
Taking the units out of PIC.
Yes.
So that is a question that has popped up recently as we've been moving through some of these streamlined conversions. And so it is a very important distinction. So I can definitely find out, if it has to be removed from PIC and RMI status, or which means that it's gone through the demo or dispo process, or if the SAC approval is enough. But I can definitely find out that clarification because it is an important one.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Jaime. We have another hand up, Kara. So this will be an unmuted question, and then we have 2 so far in the written Q&A box.
Okay.
Okay, so M. Howard, you are unmuted. M. Howard, are you muted on your end as well? Right. M. Howard, I'll chat you separately. Your hand is up, but we have allowed you to be unmuted, and we haven't heard anything. So we will move on. Okay, Kara, so we have 2 questions that came in. The first one is, if I have a property that was not included in the RAD portfolio award, what is the best approach to proceeding with RAD? Do I just submit a RAD application when ready?
Mm-hmm. Yep. If you have a project that's not within the portfolio award, you can apply to have it either put in the portfolio award if it can meet the portfolio award requirements, or you can just convert it on its own outside of the portfolio award. You just have to put in an application.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, next question. Under RAD, can a third-party investor own critical assets, charging back the owner with a usage/service fee? For example, third party would own the elevator, assume performance risk of the equipment, and maintain the equipment for a monthly usage fee. No capital funds required from the PHA/owner.
That is a very interesting question. I don't think I've ever seen or heard that coming up. I would say that our legal would probably have a lot of questions about that. I would, off the bat, I'd probably say that wouldn't work, just the way that it's structured, and the proceeds coming, and what would those proceeds be considered when they come back in? But again, I think that's a great question to put on the Rad Resource Desk. We can definitely dig a little deeper with our legal folks to see what that would entail.
Okay, great. So we'll keep this one up.
Yeah, keep that one on.
Let's see if anyone has a response to that in written form as well. Okay, so we don't have any more questions at this moment. I'm just scanning oh, here we go. All right, here's another one. All right, so how do you handle a mixed finance property that still has $1 million owing to the PHA that wants to convert to RAD?
So you have a mixed finance project that has outstanding debt for $1 million. Is that what it's saying?
I believe so.
Okay, so if
Yeah.
a mixed finance deal has, we expect that they will have existing financing already in place and already being serviced. And so you'll get into this, I think, on tomorrow's presentation when you go through the financing plan. But in your conversion overview memo, there is a section where you will identify all of the outstanding debt. And it's mostly for us to know that it's out there, and we will want to see any debt service payments in your pro forma. So even if it's considered a no debt conversion, like it's an existing property, it was just built in the last 5 years, nothing needs to be done, you're just converting from Section 9 to Section 8. It's still considered a no debt, but we do want to see your annual debt service payments in your pro forma. And that's for us to make sure that, that all expenses are being accounted for and that the project can operate. And that there's no risk to the PHA or to HUD.
Okay, great. And we have a follow-up question from the same person. I believe you may have meant to say, can you forgive the loan to the private developer?
Can the PHA forgive the loan to the private developer?
Yeah, the question was written as, can the forgive the loan to the private developer? So PHA. Okay, so can the PHA, thank you, Dale, for your clarification. Can the PHA forgive the loan to the private developer?
I don't see why not. I mean, those are all internal negotiations between the current owner and the PHA and how they want to structure it. But, you know, if the PHA, you know, wants to forgive it and not, you know, receive any payments back on it, they're more than welcome to do so.
Okay, great. All right, we'll mark that as concern. Okay, so next question. I was told that if you join a solar farm, it would work against you for financing. Is that true?
Solar. So solar is another very good question for our legal team, because there have been questions about putting solar on the public housing assets. And I'm not, to be honest, I'm not completely well versed in where those conversations had landed and what the implications are for projects. So we can definitely keep that one on the list and get back with you with a more detailed answer.
Okay, and I guess the person just clarified that it's an off-site farm. I don't know. Again, we can keep the question open for consideration for later.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. So I'm just checking the chat box, making sure we don't have anything that we've missed. And the Q&A. So those are all the questions we have right now, Kara.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's all the questions. We're about 8 minutes ahead of schedule, but I think that could leave us some extra time for the case study discussion. Kara, that's going to be led by Kara and Robert. Does that sound okay to both of you?
Sounds good.
Sure.
You want to jump right into it?
Yep.
All right, let me just go ahead and reshare my screen. Okay. All right, so this is the Robert and Kara show.
The Kara show. Guest. I'm just a guest on the panel.
All right, so for the next, I believe, 30+ish minutes, you know, we have a panel to go through with you all. And Robert and I thought that it would be a good use of time to sort of show where the CNA intersects with the financing and why it's so important to tie those two together. So we will be going through an imaginary case study that we've put together to sort of, I think, highlight some of the points that we made throughout both of our presentations.
Yeah, and one of the things that we want to make sure that comes across is that, you know, the idea here is that the PHA came into RAD without any preconceived notions of what they were going to do. So there are a lot of PHAs that know they're going to do a big redevelopment and know they're going to use tax credits, or they know they're going to do a big financing and they're going to borrow a bunch of money, or they know they have plenty of PHA. I mean, we want to talk about PHA who is open to lots of different ideas and are going to really use the results of the PCA to drive their financing. So that's the idea behind this case study.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll get started. So as Robert said, the focus is really to see and to show how a CNA drives what financing is necessary to complete the capital needs. And, you know, I think what's important to remember is that one size doesn't fit all, both in the financing and in the capital needs. Like everything is going to be very specific and tailored to your project and your asset. So you know, it might not be enough, might be too much, but we want to find that area where it's just right for the PHA.
Yeah, and hopefully the PHAs come into RAD with an open mind and are, you know, interested in, you know, doing what's best for the property based on what they can do. Because sometimes a project might need a bunch of work and there's no way to pay for it, and that's an issue. But again, too much, too little, just right. Trying to find that balance. What if you have a little bit more money and you want to do some upgrades, or you know, what if you don't have quite enough? How do you prioritize things? So that's one of the things we wanted to look at.
All right, so here are our case study details. So we're saying that the project is in Georgia. It has 50 units. Sorry. 25 one-story buildings. It's built on 7 acres. It's mostly suburban. Has a mix of 1, 2, 3 bedrooms. Built in the 70s. You know, and the PHA has been a really good PHA. They've made the upgrades necessary over the years, but the project's never gone through, you know, any real kind of overhaul. So overall, the PHA believes that their asset has been well maintained and that, you know, that their CNA should come back, you know, without any surprises.
Yes, I mean, and hearkening back to my presentation earlier, you know, built in the 70s, right? So we know it's been around for a while, and no matter how well it's been maintained, there are potentially going to be some maintenance items that the PHA either may not be aware of or may just have been kind of ignoring and thinking, oh well, you know, that's not something I need to deal with here.
Yeah. So the PHA went ahead and they commissioned their CNA from their third party. CNA providers went out, did all of their site inspections and their due diligence. And here are some photos from the site inspection, just so you could, it's really good for, I think, the RAD team to have photos because we don't get to go out to the site. So it's always good to see what we're working with. And so the photos are really important to us. And so you see, like, they all look really, you know, well maintained, kind of tired, you know, landscaping is, you know, not great. The roofs look a little, you know, a little rough. The siding looks rough, but the interiors, you know, they're old, but, you know, they're clean and well maintained and work. So the PHA's initial goals is that, you know, they definitely want to convert this project to RAD. They know that there's going to be some kind of rehab to address capital needs, like they're under no impression that it's going to come back like it's a perfect project. But at this stage, they really want to be able to do it with public housing funds only. So do a no debt transaction like we just talked about. And the PHA has tight operations. And so they really want to keep their annual deposits to an amount that's as low as possible while still meeting, you know, what they need to do for the next 20 years. All right, and so the funds that they have and that they're sort of tracking and, you know, making sure that they're, you know, sort of earmarking for any work that needs to be done is that they've got about 90,000 left in CAP funds and about 150,000 left in op funds that they can put towards this RAD conversion. All right, so the CNA comes back and, you know, the PHA is going through it and, you know, they've got some red flags here and something that they thought was going to be really minimal. The provider's coming back and is saying, you know what, you've got like $1 million worth of capital needs that need to be done in the year of conversion. So these needs are way higher than originally anticipated. And not even in year one, and not even in year of 0, which is conversion year, you've got the first 3 years, the first immediate years of another like $500,000 that need to be done. And on top of that, you're going to need to fund an IDRR that's probably going to be much higher than you anticipated in order to keep your ADRR low. And so the PHA, you know, goes back to their provider, like Robert was saying, you need to have like a really good communication flow with your provider. You need to be able to feel comfortable asking questions and knowing why things were flagged and other things weren't. And, you know, in this instance, the provider came back and said, hey, you know, most of your units have tons of termite damage. You know, that all needs to be taken care of. And you also have a lot of units that have, you know, massive mold intrusion that needs to be taken care of. And, you know, the PHA in their mind was saying, again, what Robert had talked about is, you know, well, those are things that we do through maintenance. You know, we were just going to take care of those as they came up. You know, they're not capital needs.
Right. This is a perfect example of where the PHA was just trying to patch things together. You know, that one tenant would complain about a termite situation, and they would have the termite folks come out and they would do a look, and they'd put in the necessary items, and then they would, you know, rip that particular unit's wall out and put it back in, and similarly with the mold, and they were basically just kind of limping along with paying out of their operations. And also, I wanted to highlight what Kara said, and I mentioned at the end of my presentation. You know, Recap really wants to see that even if the PHA were able to put the $1 million for the year zero rehab needs, Recap wants to see that other $500,000 done now, because that's work that really needs to be completed. If you think about when the CNA is done, the CNA is done within a year of when the financing plan is submitted. By the time the financing plan is submitted and the transaction closes, the PCA is a year old. So what was year zero in the PCA term is now year one, and what was year one is now year two. So you've already moved through the continuum a little bit. And so you need to think about your CNA as a living document, and it's showing the needs of the property moving over time. And so if I had work that I needed to do when they came out to do the site inspection, and time passes, everything they saw and anticipated that I was going to need to do, well, that's coming up now. So that's where you have to, as a PHA, think about, okay, well, I've got stuff I need to do now, and I've got stuff that's going to come up, and then I need to plan for the future. Mm-hmm. And the termite damage, the mold problems, those are fundamental problems that need to be addressed and may have been highlighted by meetings with the tenants. You know, I talked about the line of communication. Maybe the PHA thought it was a one-off thing, and it turns out they just hadn't been hearing their tenancy. The tenants came back and said, no, that's in every property. Every unit is having a problem. Mm-hmm. So in our case study, the PHA was really surprised that they needed all of this work. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that was not a pleasant conversation for the needs assessor and the PHA to have, because there's some level of friction that's there. But that's the friction that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's what needs to happen.
Exactly. So what should the PHA do? And I think we had a poll here.
I don't know if that poll was actually loaded in.
Okay.
That's okay.
No worries. We can forge ahead without it. Do not worry. So what should the PHA do? How are they going to address these findings while still being able to meet the RAD program requirements? So, we're now going to run through the 3 financing options that, were just presented and see which one fits best for the PHA and their circumstances. So option 1, no debt, right? So for this one, the PHA has $240,000 in public housing funds, and that now has to cover $1 million in capital needs just in year zero, fund the $100,000 of the IDRR, and somehow sock away enough to cover $500,000 in the next 3 years. So clearly, no debt is not financially viable option in this scenario. I think that's very, very obvious. Anything you want to add, Robert?
No, absolutely. No debt's not going to work here.
Not going to work.
Not happening.
No. So let's look at option 2, which is debt only. All right, so we're going to go back through some of the benefits of a PHA leveraging debt. So debt allows you to increase the amount of capital available to complete your required repairs, and in this case, potentially add additional scope items from years 1 through 3. So this would be debt plus their public housing funds, and maybe they're going to need some additional soft financing, whether it's a home, CDBG, or just like a local grant. That's most likely what this source will look like.
Yeah, and don't discount that, because
Yeah.
there are a lot of local sources, there are a lot of state sources.
Yeah.
There are the National Housing Trust Fund, CRA credits from banks. There are lots of different ways that creative PHAs find funding. That ever popular term, gap financing.
Yeah.
It is a real thing, and one of the reasons that Georgia came up here is because Georgia is doing some interesting stuff, and they have some opportunities there. And the National Home Loan Bank, based in Atlanta, is doing some interesting stuff for Georgia properties and Southeast properties. So take a look at those programs. Don't discount that, because in this case, you've got a PHA that has got what looks like a significant number, $1.5 million worth of work. Well, if I can take $500,000 of that off the top because I got a CDBG grant or a housing trust fund loan at interest, no interest for 30 years, that's something to consider.
Definitely. And it allows, some room to address what needs to be done now and possibly roll in what needs to be done in the next 3 years. It can also help, like we said earlier, fund reserves. So, you're paying that higher IDRR up front in order to keep your annual deposits lower. So, debt or any of these cash flow notes can go towards funding that higher IDRR.
Right.
Another thing that's interesting here that I didn't talk about in my presentation, but it's worth mentioning here, is that it's nice in the debt projects because the PHA really can maintain ownership through an instrumentality, a single asset entity. They don't need to introduce, a partner, a general part, that's not a part of this structure. So the PHA can sort of keep it still close to home.
Yeah, that's a great point, and not have to share any of that cash flow with a third party. Any developer that's going to come in, and development partner that's going to come in, they're going to want their piece of the pie. And as we continue through this example, this isn't a very big pie. Yeah,
exactly. And exactly that. And the PHA would be able to take a developer fee, which can go towards other affordable housing ventures, such as what we pointed out before, future Rad conversions. So there is room to take a small developer fee as well. So that is option 2. Sounds pretty good. And so, when a PHA is trying to evaluate this, the big thing that's driving the amount of debt that a PHA can support is really their operations and what their net operating income can support. So, here again, fictional, but we're saying, okay, the goal for the PHA here is to get $1.5 million loan. I'm sorry, $1.5 million in rehab. And so they're going to get a loan for $1 million at a rate of 3% and a term for 30 years. And so that's their goal. Can they support it? And so you go through your pro forma and you see if you can support it through your cash flow and your NOI, and if you can support the debt coverage. And so in this case, they can. They have sufficient net operating income to support $1 million loan at those terms and still cash flow decently to help them throughout the year with other operations. And they can still meet the RAD program's requirement of, a minimum of a 1.1 debt coverage ratio. So, this is good. It's totally viable.
And then they can include that op and cap funds, the $240,000, as a soft loan, and get that money potentially paid back to them as well.
Exactly. So option 3 is tax credits, which again, as we've seen, is a bulk of what our conversions tend to use, is that tax credit equity. So in that scenario, the added equity to the project can increase the amount that's available to complete the required repairs. So here, they could look at doing a 4% or a 9%. But, again, it requires some digging to see how well a project would score for 9%. Or, 4%, does it raise enough equity to make sense? The nice thing is that they could probably address the scope of work for the full 20 years. And if not the full 20 years, probably close to the first 15 years, and really get ahead of their capital needs.
Right. The bad news is that you're not likely to be able to do this on your own, right? So you're going to have a development partner.
Exactly. Yep. So, just like the debt, you can cover your reserves, you can take a developer fee, although you'll probably be splitting it at this point. But the big thing with tax credits, like I had said at the end of my presentation, is that you're going to most likely need to bring on additional expertise and guarantors. And so now we're talking about a much more complex ownership structure where you're going to have a tax credit partnership, and you're going to have different owners and syndicators are going to have different stakes and into the project. And so it can get complicated very quickly, as well as the tax credit transactions have much higher transaction, legal, and organizational costs. And so your development budget is going to be that much bigger than it would be with a no debt deal. So all think about when weighing the options.
Right, and also don't forget that this is only a 50 unit property, so there's not a lot of scale here as well.
Exactly. All right. So again, we're going to look at the cash flow, right? So in this case, the pro forma doesn't change. The project's income and expenses are what they are, and that's not going to change. So what you're looking at is really, how much can we really pull out of this project to do a 4% or 9% deal? So here we're going to say, all right, they want to move through more years in their capital needs schedule. So they really want to focus on doing $5 million in rehab. They still can only get $1 million loan because that's all their property can support. And so we're saying here, even if you have a bunch of soft financing, public housing funds, and this loan, you're going to require tax credit equity. Like, this is the example of where you're going to have to really start considering moving in that direction.
Yep. I mean, this amount of rehab and wanting to pretty much do a gut rehab and start over, that's almost the definition of a tax credit transaction.
Mm-hmm. Which is totally fine, because a lot of PHAs do it and the results are awesome. And so don't be scared of it. I just know that it comes with additional factors that need to be considered.
Yep.
So, let's evaluate the options that this PHA has. So we know that no debt is off the table. So they're looking at debt only or tax credits. And so this is just a quick summary of what we just talked about. So the debt only, they can address their immediate and short-term needs like now, right? Like they can just get that done with, sit nicely for the next 3-5 years and know that their property is well taken care of. They've got sufficient NOI to take out debt. They know that they have available soft financing. They know that their local state has some loan products that they can apply for. They keep sole ownership of the project. They get to keep it, really within house, which is nice and appealing. There's also less transactional costs with just debt-only project. And there's also less lender compliance requirements. They're really probably just going to be looking at, physical inspection reports, if that, looking at your books, looking at your audits perhaps, but, it's going to be pretty hands-off.
Yeah, it does provide you with kind of the most the most control. I mean, you get to keep control without having to give anything up on that front.
Yeah,
so, yep.
Agreed. And so tax credits, the benefits of that is that you get to address your long-term needs and really make sort of like a cornerstone property, like something that would be really great and transformative to a community. But with that, the project has to meet Housing Finance Agency underwriting requirements, which can be very stringent. You will have to introduce a tax credit partnership, so there's less control from the PHA standpoint because you're introducing more people into the ownership structure. There are higher transactional costs, like we just pointed out in the last slide. And finally, there's tax credit program compliance requirements. So for the next 15 years, you're in it. And for those 15 years, you're going to have an investor and a syndicator and IRS making sure that, what you're doing is meeting the tax credit program requirements. So
yeah, additional administrative burden, that sort of stuff, or lots of different reporting requirements and that sort of thing. So,
yeah.
I mean, the extra money comes at a cost.
Yep, exactly. So, in this case, looking at them on face value, the debt only option seems the best for this PHA. And, you know, they're able to do what they need to do and, you know, do it in a manner where they're comfortable and they're not overextending themselves, which is totally great.
Right. And I think, and the other benefit to that is the experience that they gain, because kind of taking a small step and getting that loan and working with your lender and maybe finding some additional soft financing, then in a few years, after you've been through the RAD program and you've been operating the property on its own now and you're out of public housing, then you might have an opportunity at that point in time to say, you know what, this worked really well for us. Now let's think about how we might do a tax credit transaction and refinance out of this thing and do something transformative. You know, it's kind of a nice segue into kind of the new world of acting as a project owner rather than just generally as a public housing authority.
Right. So that's how we saw this case study panning out. And so, you know, it's also, again, pictures are amazing in these contexts. And so, you know, it's important to see, you know, the results and what they can get you. You know, they can be, you know, a huge tax credit project like the one in the upper left-hand corner. That's New Haven's Farnham Courts. I mean, that was new construction, you know, total new build, which these for tax credits, you know, down to just really cleaning up the site and adding new windows and cleaning up the brickwork and, you know, maybe adding some decorative features to the awning to really just in an urban setting. You know, there's not much you can do, just make it structurally sound, and that's a-okay. Like, you know, you can do what you need to do, and it, you know, at any level.
Yeah, and RAD provides you that opportunity, and you can choose. You know, as Kara's pointed out, there are lots of different formulas here and lots of different results, none of which are bad.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're all transformative in their own way, and maybe a smaller transformation can make just as big an impact as a large transformation. You know,
exactly. And so then just looking at the interior, you know, it's, you know, providing, you know, if the financing allows, you know, updated kitchens, providing, you know, laundry for residents, even creating community space can be huge. Community space for, you know, meetings, computer labs for students. I mean, depending on what you can sort of piece together, you can make really big changes to sites. All of which, you know, the end user, the residents, you know, will be very happy with and be happy to call these, you know, buildings now, you know, calling them home for the long term.
Yep.
So, you know, that really wraps up our case study. We do want to point out that RAD has done some really great photo essays over the years of some of our you know, either high profile or complicated or innovative projects. And it's at this website. And we really encourage you to look through them. They sort of, they go through projects from all different angles. So you get, you know, perspective from the resident, perspective from the PHA. You see how the financing worked. But, you know, if you're interested in ideas or, you know, want to see how others have been able to do it, I really recommend you reading through those. They're great. Yeah,
they are, and again, it's very interesting to see how they work through kind of the process and the results, and it's nice to see. Very good to see.
Mm-hmm. So that's our case study.
Thank you, Kara and Robert. If you'd like, we've got another minute or so. We have the poll, like a recap polling question loaded in. So if you want, we could go ahead and do that now.
Great.
Okay. So I just launched the poll. So yeah, so it's a recap question. So now that you've heard all of the thoughts and answers.
That's right.
So, but maybe you guys have a different idea of what you think would have worked best.
Exactly.
Feel free to answer how you would like.
Kara and I are hardly ever right.
Never.
Right. right, I'm going to share the results. So,
Ah, interesting.
There you go.
All right, see? I like it.
all
I like
right,
that people aren't scared off by tax credits.
I like that.
Realize that, you know, debt can do just as much. Awesome,
Yep.
great.
There's lots of opportunity there.
All right, thank you.
okay. Well, thank you for the presentation, Kara and Robert. We are right on time, so we're going to move into our last session of the day, which is FHEO approvals, and that's going to be led by Celia and Alan. We'll give a moment for those slides to be loaded.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, Alan, are you on?
Yep.
You want to let us know when you want us to get started. I think we were starting with Alan first.
Okay, next slide then, please.
Next slide.
Our presentation, good afternoon, everyone. Our presentation consists of 3 parts. The first part will be a brief overview of fair housing and civil rights laws that apply to housing development. The bulk of the presentation will be how these fair housing and civil rights laws apply to RAD transactions. If indeed, as part of your proposed RAD transaction, you propose to change the number of units, change the bedroom size of some units, change the number of accessible units, change in the occupancy type. And we will talk in detail about what you need to do in order to get FHO to approve one or more of those changes. The last part will be discussing the process by which PHAs submit documents to FHEO for review of their proposed changes, the process by which FHEO reviews these, and by which they are approved. So the bulk of the presentation will be on the applicability of FH and civil rights reviews to RAD transactions. Next slide, and I'll turn it over to Celia.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alan. And can you everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so thanks, Alan. My name is Celia Carpentier, and I'm from HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And thank you so much for joining us for this presentation today to talk about RAD and fair housing. Now, RAD is really no different from any of your other PHA programs in the sense that it must comply with all fair housing and civil rights laws. The laws that you see on this slide are some of the most basic or most common fair housing and civil rights laws that really apply to all of a PHA's programs, including RAD. So many of you should already be familiar with these laws, but you know, I can walk through just some of the basic requirements of each of them. So the first law is the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and familial status. The Fair Housing Act also requires that housing providers, including PHAs, make reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications for persons with disabilities. And it also includes accessibility requirements. It requires that newly constructed multifamily housing contains certain features of accessible design to make the project accessible for persons with disabilities. The second law on the slide is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance. So among other things, under Title VI, a PHA would need to take reasonable steps to provide meaningful access to persons with limited English proficiency. So in other words, persons who, as a result of national origin, have a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. The next law that we'll talk about is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. So again, the HUD's regulations have a number of requirements under Section 504. These include providing effective communication for persons with hearing, vision, speech, or other communication-related disabilities. It also has requirements prescribing the minimum number of accessible units that must be contained within a multifamily housing project. And finally, there's Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title II prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in services, programs, and activities provided by state and local governments. So many of the requirements under Title II will mirror those of those under Section 504. One thing that we should note as part of, because the RAD program involves a lot of new construction and rehabilitation, is that when both Section 504 and the ADA apply, both accessibility standards apply, and you would need to comply with whichever accessibility standard would provide the greatest level of accessibility for persons with disabilities. So that was a quick background on the fair housing and civil rights laws. I next want to move into the specific requirements for fair housing and civil rights review under RAD. As part of the RAD program, very early in the RAD program, so in June 2015, that version of the RAD notice established a formal review process for fair housing and civil rights considerations as part of the RAD program. Again, the purpose of this review is that HUD really identified early on in the program that there were several features of the program or several activities that PHAs could conduct as part of their RAD conversions that could have implications or affect your compliance with fair housing and civil rights requirements. So one of the things we wanted to do was to make sure that RAD was used in a way that promotes compliance with these requirements. So the RAD notice established this front-end review requirement that HUD would review these activities up front, early in the RAD conversion, and to make sure that any fair housing problems are addressed on the front end rather than waiting until a problem actually arises after conversion. So about a little over a year following the establishment of the requirement for the front end civil rights reviews, HUD published a RAD Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation Notice. And this was published in November of 2016. And this is where you can really find a lot of the detail of the front end civil rights reviews that we're going to talk about today. So when I say the term front end civil rights review, I do realize that that's a term that most people do not use in their day-to-day conversations. What we really mean is that it's an upfront review. Like I mentioned earlier, that there are certain activities that HUD has identified as having fair housing and civil rights implications, and that we would just conduct a review of these activities on the front end while you're putting together your RAD conversion, rather than waiting until a potential issue arises after your project has converted. So this slide here on the screen now lists the 7 activities that I mentioned that we've identified for front-end civil rights review. I'll list them quickly here, and then we're going to go in for the rest of this presentation and go into each of these reviews individually and what the submission requirements and what are the things that you need to think about as a PHA are for each of these reviews. So the first is new construction, whether you're doing new construction on the current public housing site or on a new site. The second review is a reduction in the number of units with 2 or more bedrooms. The third activity identified in the notice is if there's going to be a reduction in the UFAS accessible units at the project or an increase above a certain threshold. In this case, increasing the mobility units above 10% of the units at the project, or increasing the hearing vision units above 4% of the total units at the project. The fourth activity is a change in the occupancy of the project. And what we mean by this is under public housing, you have a certain occupancy type. For example, if you are a general occupancy or family project under public housing, if you are going to adopt a preference as a result of the RAD conversion, that would change the occupancy of your project. So for example, if you're going to adopt an elderly preference after conversion, this is something that would be subject to a front-end civil rights review. The next activity is relocation. That is likely to exceed 12 months. We're also going to review new construction or substantial alteration of projects to ensure that they meet the requirements for the number of accessible units under Section 504. And then the last activity is transfers of assistance. So where you transfer the assistance from the current public housing site to a new site. So these are the 7 activities that we've identified, and we require PHAs to provide submissions that HUD will review. We also note in the notice that there may be other instances where HUD wants to conduct a fair housing review. This would most likely be in situations where the PHA is currently under a civil rights remedial order or agreement. So something like a voluntary compliance agreement or consent order, that we would want to make sure that your RAD conversion is consistent with that, or just any other instances where we have identified potential fair housing and civil rights violations or a history of violations with the PHA. So I know that seems like a lot. That was a very dense slide with a lot of activities. So it's important before I scare anyone too much to keep in mind that you only need to do complete submissions for activities that you are part of your RAD conversions. So some RAD conversions may not have any of these activities, and some might have more than one or all of them. The only submission requirement that we currently have that applies to all RAD conversions is something we call the FHEO accessibility and relocation checklist. This is something that needs to be submitted by all PHAs, even if you're not doing any activities related to accessibility and relocation, you would just check no on the form and you still need to submit it. We are looking at some point to revising that so that only PHAs who are actually doing those activities would need to submit the form. But as of right now, all PHAs have to submit the accessibility and relocation checklist. But as far as the rest of the reviews, like I said, it's all dependent on whether they are part of your RAD conversion. And if you are in a situation where you're looking at this list and going, oh wow, I have a lot of these or maybe all of these apply to my conversion, it's really important, and I think Alan will talk about this later when we talk about process, that you start working on your front-end civil rights reviews early, and that you reach out for technical assistance if needed early in the process. So this next slide wanted to touch on what exactly an approval or a disapproval means of your front-end civil rights reviews. So for an approval, it simply means that HUD, in this case, it's the office that I work in, the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. It means that we've looked at your submission and we accept the analysis that you've undertaken, and we don't see any potential fair housing and civil rights concerns, and therefore the RAD conversion may go forward. It's not, this is not a monitoring review, or it's not a compliance review where we're making a determination of compliance or anything like that. We're just looking to see that you have analyzed that particular activity and have, and any fair housing, that either there are no fair housing concerns or that they've been addressed as part of your conversion. Now for disapproval, now this actually it is quite consequential for your RAD conversion. If HUD issues a final disapproval of a front-end civil rights review, this could stop your whole deal from going forward. So again, it's really something we do work with PHAs as much as possible to avoid a disapproval, so that we try our best to, like I said, address any problems, any fair housing and civil rights issues, work with the PHA and address them to avoid a disapproval. But if it does come to that, it could stop your RAD conversion. Okay, so now I would like to move into just each of the separate activities that require a front-end review. So the first one I mentioned was new construction. And so this is new construction, again, whether you're doing it on the current public housing site or on a new site. In either case, you're subject to what we're referred to as site neighborhood standards. Now, again, as PHAs, you may be familiar with the site neighborhood standards regulations, as there are site neighborhood standards regulations that apply to virtually all of HUD's housing programs, and these regulations have been around for a very long time. But what the site neighborhood standards regulations cover is they really cover the suitability of your site for, you know, this HUD assisted housing, in this case, PVV or PBRA housing. And it covers really a variety of aspects, whether we're talking about civil rights compliance, which is the subject of this review, or talking about environmental quality or access to transportation or community amenities. Again, it's really looking at the suitability of the site for HUD assisted housing. So when we're looking at it for civil rights compliance, really the regulation is very clear, and it says that it generally prohibits new construction of a HUD assisted project, in this case PVV or PBRA. It would prohibit a new construction of such project in an area minority concentration unless one of two exceptions are met, and the regulations set forth an exception for circumstances where there are sufficient comparable opportunities, sufficient comparable housing opportunities outside of areas of minority concentration, or where the proposed project meets an overriding housing need. And overriding housing need is actually defined through two examples in the regulations. The first example is the project is an integral part of an overall local strategy for the preservation or restoration of the immediate neighborhood. So basically there's some sort of improvement or revitalization plan for this specific neighborhood, and that the project is an integral part of that. The second overriding housing needs exception is whether the project is in a neighborhood that is experiencing significant private investment that is leading to revitalization of that neighborhood. So again, so if your project is in an area of minority concentration, you do need to meet one of these two exceptions. And the RAD Civil Rights Notice provides quite a bit of detail on how to meet these two exceptions, which I won't go into here, but I think the important thing is to just, I want to emphasize what we're looking for in your submissions. So obviously the first step is to determine if your project is in an area minority concentration. And the way that you can do that is we have something called the RAD Minority Concentration Tool. Now this is a web-based tool where you can just go online. I think it's linked in the presentation. I won't click on it, but you can go online, or you can Google search RAD Minority Concentration Tool. You can enter the address of your project, and it will generate a report that will be emailed to you, and it'll have the demographics of the neighborhood, and it will do the calculations for you to show you whether the project meets the RAD program's definition of an area minority concentration. So that's really your first step. And then if your second step is, if you are in a concentrated area, is to claim an exception and to provide, a narrative along with supporting documentation that your site actually meets an exception. I really want to emphasize here to really provide a detailed narrative and analysis along with the supporting documentation. Please provide all of that when you submit this to a HUD for our review, because this is probably the site neighborhood standards review is definitely, out of all the reviews we'll talk about today, the one that takes the longest, and where PHAs don't give us enough information up front, or where we have to go back and forth. In the past, it has dragged on, for months and months, and we all, I think both HUD and the PHA want to avoid that. So again, really looking at the civil rights notice, understanding what you need to submit, reaching out for technical assistance, and doing all of this early in the process is really important, so we don't delay your RAD deal. The next area that is subject to front-end civil rights review is reductions in the number of units, specifically reductions in the number of units with 2 or more bedrooms. And on the next slide, we'll also mention that reductions in UFAS accessible units are also subject to front-end civil rights review. So now when we're looking at a reduction in units, for the purpose of FHU's review, there are really just a couple of areas that we're looking at. Number one, we're looking at, okay, if you're going to reduce these number of units, what is the impact on the residents? Are there any residents that won't be able to come back to the project because of this reduction? And what are the characteristics of these residents? We want to make sure from a fair housing perspective that is not resulting in a discrimination, that a certain minority group, or perhaps persons with disabilities, making sure that they are not disproportionately impacted and disproportionately precluded from returning to the project as a result of the reduction in units. We're also looking at it from the point of view of how does this impact the PHA's current housing stock and your ability to meet the needs of the low-income families in your area. And this, this review, while it applies to reduction of units with 2 or more bedrooms, really where we've run into issues is where the PHA is reducing or eliminating 4 or 5 bedroom units at the project. Again, we've seen a lot of PHAs do this, and I think it is probably because some PHAs do have maybe more of these larger units that they need, and in some cases it is warranted to perhaps reduce this number to better use, make those into smaller units so that you can serve other smaller families, which might be, there might be more of those families on your waiting list. But with the 4 and 5 bedroom units, we're really careful from a fair housing perspective, because number one, with the first issue that I mentioned about whether the family would be able to return to the project, if you're reducing units that are actually occupied by families who need that unit size, where are they going? Are you able to accommodate them in other units within the PHA's housing stock? Or if you're giving them vouchers, do they have an actual realistic opportunity to use those and get a 4 or 5 bedroom unit within your area using a voucher? So those are the things that we're asking the PHA, to analyze. Like I said, like the impact on your housing stock. Will you be able to serve the future need of larger families who need those units? And the best way for a PHA to really assess this is to, look at your waiting list data, look at your occupancy data, both current and past occupancy. You might be able to identify trends and see, what exactly is the number of these larger units that you need. So that's really the concern that we have with this. And we have had a few PHAs where we've had to kind of go, back and forth on this issue. So again, we're not saying that you cannot reduce 4 or 5 bedroom units, but we are saying to really make sure that you are taking into account the need of both your current residents and the low income population within your area. And then as a sort of a second part of the reduction in units, as I mentioned, there is a requirement for us to review if you're doing a reduction in the number of UFAS accessible units. I actually don't think we've had a PHA propose a reduction in UFAS units, at least not that I've seen. Most PHAs are using RAD to increase the accessibility of their projects and increase the number of accessible units. So this one doesn't come up too often, but again, if you have a reduction in UFAS units, that's something that HUD would need to review. And then the notice also talks about us or HUD reviewing increases in the number of UFAS units. Again, this is not saying that you cannot increase units above these certain thresholds, but that we were really looking to make sure that if you are going to increase it, that these are based on indicators of local need, and that it's not going to serve to unduly concentrate persons with disabilities in a certain project. So the triggers that are, or the thresholds that are established within the civil rights notice are, if you're going to go above 10% of the units of the project as being accessible for persons with mobility impairments, or if you're going to go above 4% of the units of the project being accessible for persons with hearing and vision impairments. Again, that's something, like I said, it's not necessarily prohibited. It's just something that requires an upfront review and approval. The next area I want to talk about is a change in occupancy. As I mentioned earlier, a change in occupancy is when, as a result of the RAD conversion, that you're going to adopt a preference is going to basically change the occupancy of the site. And again, where we've seen some fair housing issues come up is when you're taking a family project and you're going to convert it and adopt an elderly preference after conversion. And the fair housing concerns here are really similar to what we talked about with the unit reduction. So you're really looking at what happens to the residents at the project. Will all residents still be able to come back even though the PHA is adopting this new preference? And also looking at what is the impact on your housing stock with this new preference going forward by changing the occupancy. Are there now going to be too few family units and then more heavily skew your PHA inventory towards elderly housing? So those are things that the PHA would need to consider based on their own housing needs and based on their waiting list and their occupancy data. A couple of things I do want to point out with this review is that unlike public housing, in PBV and PBRA, there is no designation of elderly housing. So we again have had some confusion with PHAs. Under public housing, you can have a project as designated for elderly only, but under Section 8, you can't have a designation. However, you could have a preference for elderly families. And then the other thing that's also we've had some confusion on is this review is strictly for the purpose of a RAD, a front-end civil rights review. It doesn't take the place of any requirements under the PBV or PBRA program. So you would still need to follow the requirements under those programs for adopting any sort of preferences. So yeah, the next area I want to talk about is relocation exceeding 12 months. And as you heard me say a little bit earlier, right now, all PHAs have to submit an FHEO accessibility and relocation checklist. So you still have to submit a submission that details answers the questions about the relocation that are in the relocation checklist, even if you are not doing relocation exceeding 12 months. We are revising the templates, and we hope to change that in the future. So hopefully in the near future, but as of right now, all PHAs have to submit the FHEO accessibility and relocation plan checklist. And I think the thing I want to really, again, emphasize here is where the only times we've really run into issues with the relocation checklist, again, is when the PHA has indicated to us in like a unit reduction or a change in occupancy review that maybe some families are going to be they've accepted a voluntary permanent relocation elsewhere, but then we've later received a relocation checklist that either said there was no relocation, or it didn't tell us where those families were going or what options were provided to them. So we're really looking for your relocation checklist to really match and support what you're telling us in your other checklists, and to really provide us the detail that's asked for in the checklist regarding, how many families are being relocated, what were they offered, where are they going, what are the demographics of these families, those sorts of things. And like I said, in really making sure that it supports and it's consistent with what you're telling us in your other submissions. And then the next area of review is accessibility. As I mentioned, again, this would all be on the FHEO accessibility and relocation checklist. This review is actually, it's pretty simple. It applies just to new construction or substantial alteration of a project. So projects that are undergoing one of those activities, as new construction and substantial alteration are defined under Section 504. And this is really just making sure that the PHA has committed to provide the minimum number of accessible units in the project. So under HUD Section 504 regulations, multifamily housing projects have to have a minimum of 5% of the units be accessible for persons with mobility impairments, have an additional 2% accessible to persons with hearing and vision impairments. So again, in the checklist, this is where the PHA would sort of list out their units and the numbers and the bedroom distribution of the units that will be accessible. The notice also asks that we confirm whether the PHA is using the correct accessibility standards. So for the purposes of Section 504. There are really two accessibility standards that would meet Section 504 requirements. The PHA could either use the UFAS standards or HUD's deeming notice in conjunction with the 2010 ADA standards. Again, we don't really have too many issues with the accessibility reviews. I think the only places where we have had some questions come up is, I guess, sometimes in RAD, depending on how your CHAP is structured, sometimes more than one project might be on a CHAP, and so therefore they're sending us, you might be submitting a checklist, an accessibility checklist that covers more than one project, and in this case, you wouldn't need to give us your accessible units by project. You couldn't aggregate them all into one number. We're actually looking for the number of mobility and hearing vision units at each project. So again, we would just ask that you separate out that data by project. And then the other area where questions have come up is when, in some cases, a PHA might be under a Section 504 remedial agreement, such as a voluntary compliance agreement, that would require the PHA to provide a higher number of accessible units above the 5% and 2% that are required in HUD's regulations. And in this case, the checklist would need to be consistent with that. So if you're under a Section 504 BCA that required a higher number, that higher number would need to be reflected within your checklist. So the final area of review is transfers of assistance. And this is where you're transferring the assistance from the current public housing site to a new site. And right now there's actually no template available for the PHAs to use. So we are actually not conducting front end reviews of transfers of assistance at this time. However, I do want to make you aware of the requirements that the civil rights notice sets forth regarding transfers of assistance, because transfers of assistance can actually be quite consequential from a fair housing perspective. So there's the two ways that the civil rights notice, or the two areas of potential fair housing concern that are identified in the notice is, one, considering the accessibility of the site of where you're transferring the assistance to. This especially comes up if you're transferring the assistance to an existing project. Now, Section 504 regulations, there are specific site selection requirements under HUD Section 504 regulations, and you're prohibited from selecting a site that would discriminate against persons with disabilities. So you really need to look at the site and determine, is it accessible? Is this someplace that, if it's not accessible now, can it be made accessible as part of the RAD conversion so that a person with disabilities would have an equal opportunity to live at the project? Again, this is also especially important if you have any persons with disabilities, especially mobility or hearing vision and disabilities at your current project, who would have a right to return to that project receiving the assistance. Now, they could not be denied their right to return under RAD because the project is not accessible. So you would need to find a way to provide that accessible unit within the project receiving the transfer assistance. The second way that transfers assistance can really affect fair housing is looking at the demographics and looking at, would the transfer assistance really perpetuate or exacerbate segregated housing patterns? Like, are you transferring from a non-concentrated site to a concentrated area? Are you transferring, or the way the civil rights notice phrases it is, if whether you are transferring the assistance to an area with a significantly higher minority concentration. Again, this is something that PHAs would really need to examine, because this could be potentially problematic from a fair housing standpoint if the transfer of assistance would serve to, again, like create or perpetuate segregation. So again, I think those are two very important fair housing areas related to transfers of assistance. However, we don't have a template for you to submit to us at this time for us to review. So no review is required at this point. But again, the civil rights implications are pretty significant. So we really urge PHAs to really take a close look at that when planning their transfers of assistance. With that, that is actually the final. We managed to walk through all of the different activities that HUD reviews, and now I'd like to turn it back over to Alan. He'll talk about the process for submitting these reviews.
Next slide, please. Okay. This basically is a chart to show the review process. On the concept call checklist, you will answer questions concerning any of the proposed changes that Celia has described. And depending upon what you fill out, either there will be a grid saying which FHAO categories apply or which don't apply. But remember, as Celia said, everyone has to complete the accessibility and relocation checklist no matter what. Then what you'll do for each of the categories that apply to your transaction, you will upload the appropriate documents on the Rad Resource Desk. And those will automatically then be delivered to Celia and her colleagues. And they will begin their review of the documents that the PHA has submitted. FHO has 60 calendar days to review the documents, but usually takes much less time. And generally, when they find an issue or comment, they let us know. We get a weekly update from Celia's colleagues and her department on the status of all FHO requests that have taken 60 days or more to respond, but we also talk informally when there are issues that have come up. At the end of FHO's completion of its review of any particular category which applies to your transaction, FHO will upload a letter of approval or disapproval to the Rad Resource Desk. If it's a letter of disapproval, the letter will give the PHA an opportunity to resubmit documents and will state what was the missing evidence that now the PHA should try to submit. And the area in which this has occurred a few times, as Celia knows, is on the site and neighborhood standards. That's the one I have found in which we have lots of difficulty at times getting PHAs to understand what kind of documents need to be submitted. Celia briefly stated that right now, there is not a template for FHO to review and approve transfer of assistance requests. RAD itself does a review of all transfer of assistance requests. So that is something that if you're doing, RAD will review, not FHEO. Remember, Celia has said before, you cannot have a concept call before FHEO review and approval of any of these categories, as well as the review and approval of the accessibility and relocation checklist. So please, once you get started uploading a variety of documents, once you have your chat, do not ignore the FHEO elements. If any of those apply to you, start filling them out and uploading the documents. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I am the person who is the contact between RAD and FHEO. My email address is at the bottom of the screen. And as I say, I meet regularly with Celia on FHO issues. Do not hesitate to ask questions. Some of the items are not as simple as you would like them to be, but Celia can explain them quite simply. And it's important that, as I said before, you get started early. And never be shy in any aspect of RAD, whether it be FHO or others, to ask for technical assistance. At the beginning of the presentation, Celia had a screen where she referenced the 2016 notice. Please look at that carefully because that can give you insight as to what is the evidence you need to submit for getting approval by FHEO of any of the categories for which you need to submit documentation. One other caution, please make sure that if you fill out that something doesn't apply, that the box says NA on your RAD screen. Occasionally we do get false negatives. So once you have completed the concept called checklist, please go into the page on the Rad Resource Desk for FHEO for the particular chat and make sure it is completed correctly, because sometimes we do find things that are NA, indicated NA that are not, or vice versa. And that's all I have to say. We will be happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Celia and Alan. I'm going to pass it over to Erica for our questions.
Okay, we have a few questions. Some of them are a little long, so I will just I'll read what we have in a chat box first, so make sure that I don't forget those. The first question is, hello, we will be working with all parties. Oh, I'm sorry. That was my question. That was my posting. I'm sorry. Okay, transferring assistance to a non-public housing site that the project will be newly construction. Is the SNS required for the site for all the TOA units?
Yes. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're transferring assistance to a new construction housing project.
To a non-public housing site, right? That
but it
will be newly constructed, right? New
Yeah, so if it's new construction, it still has to undergo a site neighborhood standards review, and that applies even if the transferred units are not all of the units at the project. So it sounds like in this case, they might be only a percentage or a portion of the units of the project, but if you are transferring to new construction, we still do a site neighborhood standards review.
Okay, great. Okay, next question from the chat box. What if we are wanting to do new construction and convert 1 bedrooms to 2 bedrooms? If the initial tenant is allowed to move into these units, does FHEO consider this problematic?
So if make sure I understand, they're converting 1 bedroom to 2 bedroom units, so that's not a reduction of any of the unit sizes that we described, so we wouldn't have to review it there. And then it also sounds like if you're letting all the residents return, then we also sounds like we wouldn't have any relocation issues. So again, you would probably have to note that on your relocation checklist that folks are all returning. But it doesn't sound like you would have to do a unit reduction because you're only reducing 1 bedroom units.
Okay. All right, so I'll go to the questions in the Q&A box. This one here, and if the property is not located in an area of minority concentration, is all of this applicable?
They're talking about specifically, if you're talking about the site neighborhood standards review, you would still have to do a submission. So you would have to go to the RAD minority concentration tool and generate the report showing that the site is not in an area minority concentration. And that would pretty much be the end of your submission. You would just have to submit that showing that it's not in an area of minority concentration. But you wouldn't have to claim one of the exceptions that we talked about.
Okay. Here's another question. Can a PHA change the occupancy type during a RAD conversion? Example, from general occupancy to elderly or senior occupancy? If yes, what are the requirements to do so?
So the answer is yes, again, with a couple of clarifications, remembering that there's no designation under Section 8, so you'd be adopting an elderly preference, and whether you're going PBV or PBRA, those program regulations might have specific requirements about what you need to do in order to adopt that elderly preference. But as far as RAD, that would come in as a change in occupancy submission, and you would submit that, like I said, providing the information asked for. There's a template. All of these reviews, except for transfers of assistance, all of these reviews have templates on the Rad Resource Desk. So for this one, in the change in occupancy review, you would fill out that submission, and we would review it and determine whether or not we could approve it or if we need more information from the PHA.
Okay, so I think this question just kind of doubles down on clarifying that. So this specific question from a different person said, did Celia just say that you can't have an elderly designation under Section 8? Was she talking about vouchers or project-based Section 8?
Right, yeah, as far as I know, and I'm not the program office, I'm the fair housing office, but my understanding of Section 8 is that there's no designation the way there is under public housing. But however, you can adopt a preference, like an elderly preference for elderly families at the project. But I believe designation is specific, the term designation is specific to public housing. But I don't know if there are any of my program colleagues on the line that want to clarify that.
Okay. Christina, do we have time for a few more questions, or we're kind of at time?
We have a minute left, so if you have one more short question, otherwise we can move to closing comments if there are longer questions.
Okay, I'll just take this one short one,
Okay.
and the rest we'll be able to answer written form. Is there a threshold for changes in a project that would trigger a re-review?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure what they mean, a re-review, but I mean, if, yeah, I mean, I guess if the things change, like if you're not reducing units and then suddenly you are reducing units, you would need to do that submission. But I guess maybe they're saying if they maybe submitted a unit, for example, like a unit reduction, they submitted they're reducing 3 4-bedroom units, and now they're going to reduce 4 4-bedroom units, and that's a change. As of right now, that would still require a new submission, but you could probably just, you should probably, I would suggest reaching out to your recap contact, perhaps reaching out to Alan or your TM and asking about those specific changes, and then Alan can come to me about whether that would require another review or not.
Okay, great. We have a few more in the queue, but again, we'll respond to those in written format.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thank you again, Celia and Alan, for this presentation. Just a few closing comments before we wrap up for the day. If you have already signed up for a coffee break session with HUD staff, you should have the link in the chat, also on the resource desk. Additionally, when you close out of the presentation, there'll be a survey that pops up when the meeting ends. And there is, just to highlight, there's a question if you do want to sign up for a coffee break session. There's a question in there to help show that you are interested and get you in touch with us so we can sign you up. And then lastly, the PowerPoints for yesterday and today are also found on the resource desk. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us for day 2, and we hope to see you again tomorrow. Thank you.